Welcome, beloved. Thank you for joining us for today's Bible story. I'm always amazed to see how God's Word reaches people all around the world. Where are you watching from right now? Please comment your country below. I read every single one. If you enjoy this story, please hit that like button and subscribe so you never miss our next video. God bless you, and let's begin with the story of Noah. Long ago, many generations after God had created the first man and woman, Adam and Eve, the world had grown crowded with people. Cities had sprung up. Families had multiplied across the land. But something had gone terribly wrong. The people of earth had turned away from God. They had become wicked in their hearts. Violence filled the streets. Cruelty became common. People hurt each other without thinking twice. They stole from their neighbors. They lied and cheated. They thought only of themselves and their own desires. Every day, people made evil choices. Every night, they plotted more wickedness. The thoughts in their minds were corrupt. The intentions of their hearts were dark. From morning until evening, from one year to the next, humanity sank deeper into sin. God looked down from heaven and saw all of this. His heart was filled with pain. He was grieved. The Bible says that God was sorry he had made human beings on the earth. The wickedness troubled him deeply. It hurt him to see what his creation had become. The earth itself had become corrupt. Violence had spread everywhere like a disease. The beauty of God's creation had been spoiled by human evil. The world God had made so carefully, so perfectly, had been ruined. God made a difficult decision. He decided that he would destroy the earth. He would wipe away humanity and start again. The wickedness had gone too far. There seemed to be no hope for the people. They had rejected God completely, but there was one exception. In the midst of all this darkness, there was one man who was different. His name was Noah. While everyone around him chose evil, Noah chose to follow God. While others lived for themselves, Noah tried to live rightly. While the world became more corrupt each day, Noah remained faithful. The Bible describes Noah as a righteous man. This means he tried to do what was right. He was blameless among the people of his time. This doesn't mean Noah was perfect. No human being is perfect, but it means that Noah genuinely tried to obey God. He cared about doing good. He walked with God. Noah had a family. He had a wife who supported him. He had 3 sons. Their names were Shem, Ham, and Japheth. These sons were grown men. Each of them had a wife as well. So Noah's household consisted of 8 people total: Noah and his wife, their 3 sons, and their 3 daughters-in-law. Noah lived in a world that must have been very lonely for him. Imagine being surrounded by people who mock what you believe. Imagine living among neighbors who think your faith is foolish. Everyone around Noah had rejected God. But Noah held firm to his beliefs. He did not let the culture around him change who he was. God noticed Noah. In a world full of evil people, God saw one man who still honored him. God saw one family that still tried to live rightly. And God decided to save Noah and his family from the destruction that was coming. One day God spoke to Noah. We don't know exactly how God communicated with him. Perhaps God spoke in an audible voice. Perhaps God gave Noah a vision. Perhaps God placed thoughts in Noah's mind that he knew came from heaven. However it happened, God's message was clear. God told Noah about his plans. He explained that he was going to destroy the earth because of human wickedness. He was going to send a great flood. Water would cover everything. Every living creature on land would die. The entire world as Noah knew it would be washed away. But God also gave Noah hope. God told Noah that he had found favor in God's eyes. God promised to save Noah and his family. God was going to make a covenant with Noah. A covenant is like a special promise or agreement. God would protect Noah. God would preserve his family. God would give them a future. Then God gave Noah very specific instructions. Noah needed to build something huge, something unlike anything anyone had ever built before. God told Noah to build an ark. Now, the word ark might sound mysterious, but it simply means a large boat or vessel. This wasn't going to be just any boat, though. This was going to be enormous. God gave Noah precise measurements and detailed plans. God told Noah exactly how long the ark should be. It should be 300 cubits in length. A cubit was an ancient measurement based on the length from a man's elbow to his fingertips. That's roughly 18 inches, or about 45 centimeters. So 300 cubits would be about 450 feet long, or 137 meters. That's longer than a football field. The ark would be 50 cubits wide. That's about 75 feet, or 23 meters. The ark would be 30 cubits high. That's about 45 feet, or 14 meters. As tall as a 4-story building, God specified what material Noah should use. He should make it of gopher wood. Scholars today aren't entirely certain what type of wood gopher wood was. It might have been cypress or another sturdy timber. Whatever it was, it needed to be strong and durable. God told Noah to make rooms inside the ark. The ark would be divided into compartments. These rooms would hold different animals and supplies. The ark needed to be organized. Everything would have a place. God instructed Noah to coat the ark with pitch. Pitch is a sticky, tar-like substance. It would make the ark waterproof. Noah should cover the inside with pitch and the outside with pitch. This would seal the wood. It would keep water from seeping through the cracks. The ark should have 3 decks. There would be a lower deck, a middle deck, and an upper deck. These 3 floors would provide lots of space. God told Noah to put a roof on the ark. The roof should have an opening. This opening should be about 18 inches below the roof line. This would allow light and air to come in. God said to put a door in the side of the ark. This door would be the entrance. All the animals would come through this door. Noah's family would enter through this door. It would be the only way in and the only way out. Noah received these instructions from God. Think about what must have gone through his mind. He had never built anything like this before. No one had. Ships of this size wouldn't be built again for thousands of years. Noah had never seen rain fall from the sky in great quantities. The Bible suggests that before the flood, the earth was watered differently, perhaps by mist or dew. The concept of a flood that would cover the entire earth must have seemed unimaginable. But Noah believed God. Despite how impossible it seemed, Noah trusted that God was telling the truth. Noah had faith that God would do exactly what he said. So Noah began to work. He gathered his sons. He explained what God had told him. He shared the plans for the ark. Shem, Ham, and Japheth listened to their father. They chose to believe him. They chose to help him with this massive project. First, they needed to gather materials. They needed enormous amounts of wood. Think about how much timber would be required for a ship this size. They would need hundreds and hundreds of trees. They would have to cut down these trees. They would have to strip off the bark. They would have to cut the wood into planks and beams. This was before modern tools. Noah didn't have chainsaws or electric sanders. He had hand tools, axes and saws and planes. Everything had to be done through hard physical labor. Every tree had to be felled by hand. Every plank had to be shaped by hand. They needed pitch for waterproofing. They had to gather this pitch or make it. This required time and effort. They needed tools and equipment. They needed ropes and measuring devices. They needed ways to lift heavy beams into place. The work was backbreaking. Day after day, week after week, month after month, they labored. The sun beat down on them. Their muscles ached. Their hands developed calluses. Splinters pierced their skin. Sweat poured from their bodies. The Bible doesn't tell us exactly how long it took Noah to build the ark, but it gives us clues. Between the time God warned Noah and the time the flood came, 120 years may have passed. Some scholars think the actual construction might have taken between 55 and 75 years. Think about that. Decades of work, an entire lifetime spent building one vessel. Noah was 500 years old when his sons were born. People lived much longer in those ancient times. Noah was 600 years old when the flood came. So Noah was an old man, by our standards, when he did this work. The ark began to take shape. The massive wooden frame rose from the ground. The hull formed. The 3 decks were constructed, one on top of another. The rooms were divided. The pitch was applied, layer after layer, inside and out. As Noah worked, the people around him must have noticed. You can't build something this enormous without attracting attention. The ark would have been visible from far away. People would have come to look at it. They would have asked questions. "Noah, what are you doing?" "I'm building an ark." "An ark? Why?" "God is going to send a flood. He's going to destroy the earth because of wickedness." We can imagine how people responded. They probably laughed. They probably mocked him. They probably thought he was crazy. A flood. Cover the whole earth? Water from the sky? Ridiculous. The Bible tells us that Noah was also a preacher. As he built the ark, he warned people. He told them about God's coming judgment. He urged them to turn away from their evil ways. He preached righteousness. He tried to help people understand that they needed to change. But no one listened. Year after year, Noah warned them. Year after year, they ignored him. They went on with their lives. They continued in their wickedness. They saw the ark growing bigger and bigger, but they didn't believe. They heard Noah's warnings, but they didn't care. Perhaps at first, people were just curious. Maybe some were amused. As years passed, they probably got bored with Noah's project. The crazy old man building a boat became a fixture in the community. Children probably grew up hearing stories about strange Noah and his ark. But no one took him seriously. Noah kept working. His sons kept helping. Their wives supported them. The ark continued to grow. Finally, after all those years of labor, the ark was finished. It stood complete, a massive wooden ship sitting on dry ground. 3 decks, rooms, a roof, a door, waterproofed inside and out, ready for its purpose. When the ark was complete, God gave Noah new instructions. It was time to bring animals aboard the ark. God was going to preserve not just Noah's family, but also the animals of the earth. God told Noah to bring 2 of every kind of animal into the ark, 1 male and 1 female. This way, after the flood, the animals could reproduce. They could repopulate the earth. But for certain animals, God gave different instructions. For clean animals, Noah should bring 7 pairs. That's 14 of each clean animal. Clean animals were those that would later be used for food and sacrifice. This included certain types of livestock and birds. Noah needed to bring animals of every kind. Land animals of all sizes. Large animals like elephants and giraffes. Medium animals like deer and wolves. Small animals like rabbits and rodents. Tiny animals like mice and insects. Reptiles like snakes and lizards. Birds of every type, from eagles to sparrows. Now, you might wonder, how did Noah gather all these animals? How did he find them? How did he bring them to the ark? The Bible gives us the answer. God brought the animals to Noah. Noah didn't have to go searching across the earth. He didn't have to trap animals or hunt them down. God sent them. Somehow, by God's power, the animals came. This was a miracle. Animals that normally feared humans walked up to the ark. Predators that would usually hunt certain prey animals walked peacefully alongside them. Natural enemies approached together without fighting. Wild animals that could not normally be tamed came willingly. God gave the animals the instinct to come to Noah. Perhaps God placed knowledge in their minds. Perhaps he guided them supernaturally. However he did it, the animals came. Think about the incredible scene this must have been. Picture animals arriving from all directions, coming down from the mountains, emerging from the forests, walking across the plains, birds flying in from distant places. The animals came in pairs. 2 by 2 they approached the ark, 7 by 7 for the clean animals. They lined up. They waited their turn. They entered through the door that Noah had built according to God's instructions. Noah and his family guided the animals. They directed them to the right rooms. They organized them on the different decks. Large animals on the lower deck, where the ark was most stable. Smaller animals on the upper decks. Each kind of animal had its place. The ark filled with sounds. The roar of lions, the trumpet of elephants, the chirping of birds, the bleating of sheep, the buzzing of insects, every creature making its own noise. It must have been overwhelming. Noah also had to bring food. The animals would need to eat during the flood. Noah and his family would need to eat. God had told Noah to store up food. Food for every kind of animal. Food for his family. This was another enormous task. Different animals eat different things. Some eat plants. Some eat meat. Some eat insects. Some eat seeds. Some eat fruit. Noah had to gather appropriate food for each type of creature. He needed hay and grains for livestock. He needed meat for carnivores. He needed seeds and nuts for birds. He needed leaves and plants for herbivores. He needed everything necessary to sustain all these creatures for a long time. The storage rooms filled with supplies, dried foods, preserved foods, whatever could last for months without spoiling. Water storage was needed too. Every living thing would need fresh water to drink. Finally, everything was ready. The ark was built. The animals were aboard. The food was stored. There was nothing left to do but wait for God's timing. Noah was now 600 years old. It was the 17th day of the second month of Noah's 600th year. The Bible records the date specifically. This was going to be a day that changed everything. God spoke to Noah one more time. God told Noah to enter the ark, to bring his family inside. Noah, his wife, his 3 sons, and their wives. All 8 people who would be saved from the flood. Noah obeyed. He gathered his family. They took one last look at the world they knew, the land they had lived on, the places they had walked, the sights they had seen. Everything was about to change forever. They walked up to the ark. They stepped through the door. They entered the vessel that had taken so many years to build. They went inside with the animals. They closed themselves in with all those creatures. And then God did something extraordinary. God himself shut the door. The Bible specifically says that the Lord shut him in. God sealed the ark. He closed the door from the outside. He made it secure. This was significant. Noah didn't seal himself in. God did it. This showed that God was in control. God was the one protecting Noah and his family. God was the one who would preserve them through what was coming. Inside the ark, Noah and his family waited. Outside, the world went on as usual. People continued their daily activities. They ate and drank. They bought and sold. They planted crops. They got married. They went to parties. Life seemed normal. The people who had mocked Noah probably walked past the ark. Maybe they noticed the door was closed. Maybe they made jokes about it. The crazy old man has finally locked himself in his boat. They probably laughed. They probably thought Noah looked foolish. They had no idea what was about to happen. Then it began. On that same day when Noah entered the ark, the springs of the great deep burst forth. Underground water sources broke through the surface. Water shot up from beneath the ground. It was as if the earth itself was breaking apart. At the same time, the floodgates of the heavens opened. Rain began to fall. Not a gentle rain. Not a shower. This was a deluge. Water poured from the sky in torrents. It was as if the sky itself was falling. The rain didn't stop. It continued hour after hour. The water kept coming, from above and from below, from the sky and from the depths of the earth. Water, water, everywhere. At first, maybe people weren't too concerned. It was just rain. But the rain kept falling. Puddles formed. The puddles became pools. The pools became ponds. The water level rose steadily. People must have started to worry. The rain wasn't stopping. The water was getting deeper. It was covering the ground. It was rising past their ankles, then their knees, then their waists. Panic must have set in. People realized something terrible was happening. This wasn't just a rainstorm. This was exactly what Noah had warned them about. Noah had been right all along. Perhaps people rushed to the ark. They pounded on the door. They called out to Noah, "Let us in. We were wrong. Please save us." But the door was sealed. God had shut it. It couldn't be opened from the outside. It was too late. The Bible doesn't describe this scene, but we can imagine the terror. Families scrambling to higher ground, people climbing hills and mountains, trying to escape the rising water. But there was no escape. The rain continued for 40 days and 40 nights. Day and night, night and day, for more than a month, water poured from heaven. It never stopped. Not for a moment. Not for an hour. Constant, relentless rain. The water rose higher and higher. It covered the valleys. It filled the lowlands. It crept up the hillsides. It climbed the mountains. Every living thing that breathed air and lived on land died. The flood showed no mercy. People drowned. Animals drowned. Birds tried to fly but eventually exhausted themselves and fell into the water. There was nowhere to land, nowhere to rest. The water covered everything. The Bible says that the water rose 15 cubits above the highest mountains. That's about 22 feet, or 7 meters, above the peaks. Even the tallest mountains were completely submerged. The entire earth was covered with water. Every living thing on land was wiped out. Every person who had rejected God, every creature that breathed air, all flesh died. All of humanity perished except for the 8 people safe inside the ark. Inside the ark, Noah and his family were safe. The vessel floated on the surface of the water. It rose with the flood. God had designed it perfectly. The pitch kept the water out. The structure was sound. The ark rode the waves. But life inside the ark was not easy. Think about the challenges Noah's family faced. They were living in close quarters with thousands of animals. The smell must have been overwhelming. The noise must have been constant. The work must have been exhausting. The animals needed care. They needed to be fed every day. They needed fresh water. Their living spaces needed to be cleaned. Waste had to be removed somehow. This was a daily, never-ending task. Noah had 8 people to do all this work, 8 humans caring for thousands of creatures. They must have developed a system. Each person probably had specific responsibilities. They worked together as a team. There was no sunlight inside the ark. Only the light that came through the window opening below the roof. The days must have blurred together. Time must have felt strange. Without the normal rhythm of sunrise and sunset, without the ability to go outside, life was reduced to basic survival and animal care. The ark rocked and swayed on the water. Storms probably battered it. Waves crashed against its sides, but the ark held firm. It didn't leak. It didn't break apart. God's design was perfect. Noah and his family had to trust God completely. They couldn't see outside. They didn't know what was happening in the world. They only knew that water surrounded them. They had to have faith that God would preserve them, that He would keep His promise, that someday this would end. The 40 days of rain finally stopped, but the water didn't immediately go away. The earth was completely flooded. There was nowhere for the water to drain. The ark continued to float on a world covered by water. The Bible tells us that Noah's family stayed on the ark for over a year, more than 12 months inside that wooden vessel. More than 365 days of caring for animals and waiting for the flood to recede. During this time, God didn't forget Noah. The Bible specifically says, "But God remembered Noah." God was watching over the ark. God was aware of his faithful servant and the family he had preserved. After 150 days, God made a wind blow over the earth. The wind helped the water start to go down. The springs of the deep were closed. The floodgates of heaven were shut. No more water came from below or above. Gradually, slowly, the water level dropped. Day by day, week by week, the water receded. It was a slow process, not dramatic, just steady. On the 17th day of the 7th month, something important happened. The ark came to rest on solid ground. It settled on the mountains of Ararat. After months of floating, the ark was finally touching earth again. But Noah couldn't leave yet. The ark was sitting on a mountaintop. Everything around it was still covered with water. Noah and his family had to continue waiting. They waited for more than 2 more months. On the first day of the 10th month, other mountaintops became visible. The water had dropped enough that peaks started to appear. Like islands emerging from the ocean, the high places began to show. Noah could see through the window now. He could see that the water was going down. But was it safe to leave? Was there dry ground yet? Noah needed to find out. 40 days after seeing the mountaintops, Noah opened the window wider. He decided to send out a bird to test conditions outside the ark. Noah took a raven and released it. The raven flew out into the open air. It must have felt wonderful to fly freely after so long inside. The raven flew back and forth. It kept going out and coming back. It didn't find a place to land. It didn't find food, so it kept returning to the ark. Noah tried something else. He took a dove and sent it out. Doves need trees and plants. If the dove found a place to land, that would mean vegetation was appearing. That would mean the earth was drying. The dove flew out. It searched for a resting place. But there was nothing. No trees, no branches, no dry ground. The waters still covered everything. The dove couldn't find anywhere to settle. It returned to Noah. Noah reached out and brought the dove back into the ark. He would wait longer. He would be patient. 7 days passed. Noah sent the dove out again. He gave it another chance to find land. This time the dove was gone longer. Noah waited and watched. When the dove returned, it had something in its beak, an olive leaf, fresh and green. The dove had found an olive tree. This meant the water had receded enough for trees to appear. The earth was recovering. Plants were surviving. Life was returning to the world. Noah must have felt such joy seeing that olive leaf. It was a sign of hope, a promise that the flood was ending, that soon they would be able to leave the ark, that God was restoring the earth. Noah waited another 7 days. Then he sent the dove out a 3rd time. The dove flew away. Noah watched it go. He waited for it to return. But this time, the dove didn't come back. The dove had found a place to live. It had found food and shelter. The earth was ready to support life again. By the 1st day of the 1st month of Noah's 601st year, the water had dried up from the earth. Noah removed the covering of the ark. He looked out over the world. What he saw must have been astonishing. The landscape had completely changed. Nothing looked the same. The flood had reshaped everything. Mountains had eroded. Valleys had filled. The geography of the entire earth was different, but the ground was still muddy. It wasn't quite ready yet. Noah waited a little longer. By the 27th day of the 2nd month, the earth was completely dry. Then God spoke to Noah, "Come out of the ark, you and your wife and your sons and their wives. Bring out every kind of living creature that is with you. Let them multiply on the earth and be fruitful and increase in number." It was time. After more than a year inside the ark, Noah and his family could finally leave. They could step back onto solid ground. They could breathe fresh air. They could see the sun and feel the wind. Imagine that moment. The door opened, natural light flooded in. The smell of fresh air, the feeling of freedom. After so long in that enclosed space, the outside world must have seemed overwhelming. Noah went first. He stepped out onto the earth. His feet touched ground that had been completely underwater just weeks before. He looked around at this new world, this cleansed earth, this fresh start. His wife followed him. Then their sons, then their daughters-in-law. All 8 people who had been saved from the flood. They stood together on the mountainside, grateful to be alive. Then came the animals. One by one, pair by pair, they emerged from the ark. They walked, hopped, slithered, and crawled down from the vessel. They spread out across the mountain. They began to explore their new home. The birds flew into the sky. They soared on the wind. They called out in joy. The animals ran and jumped. They were free. After so long confined in the ark, they could roam again. Noah and his family watched as the animals departed. Thousands of creatures heading off in different directions, going to repopulate the earth, to fill it with life once more. To be fruitful and multiply, just as God had commanded. Noah's first act after leaving the ark was to worship God. Noah built an altar. An altar is a special place for offering sacrifices to God. Noah gathered stones and stacked them. He created a place to honor the God who had saved him. Then Noah took some of the clean animals and birds. He offered them as burnt offerings on the altar. This was a sacrifice of thanksgiving, a way of saying thank you to God for his protection, for his mercy, for his faithfulness. The smoke from the offerings rose into the sky. The smell drifted up to heaven. God was pleased with Noah's worship. God saw that Noah's heart was grateful, that Noah honored him, that Noah still walked faithfully with him. God made a decision in his heart. He would never again curse the ground because of humans. He would never again destroy all living creatures the way he had just done. Even though human hearts would still be inclined toward evil, God would show patience. He would not send another flood like this. Then God blessed Noah and his sons. He told them to be fruitful and increase in number, to fill the earth, to have children and grandchildren, to repopulate the world. Humanity would have a fresh start. God also established new rules for how humans and animals would relate. Animals would fear humans from now on. Humans would have authority over animals. Humans could eat animal meat for food. This was something new. Before the flood, it seems people ate only plants. Now God gave permission to eat meat. But God also gave an important rule about life. Humans should not eat meat that still has blood in it. Blood represents life. Life belongs to God. Blood should be treated with respect. Most importantly, human life was sacred. Murder was absolutely wrong. Whoever shed human blood would have their own blood shed. Human beings were made in God's image. To kill a person was to attack God's image. Human life was precious and must be protected. Then God made a covenant with Noah. A covenant is a solemn promise or agreement. God promised that never again would a flood destroy the earth. Never again would all life be cut off by water. Never again would the whole world be covered by flood waters. God gave Noah and his family a sign of this promise. God said, "I have set my rainbow in the clouds, and it will be the sign of the covenant between me and the earth." When clouds gathered and rain fell, a rainbow would appear. Whenever people saw a rainbow, they should remember God's promise. God himself said that when he saw the rainbow in the clouds, he would remember his covenant. The rainbow was a reminder for both God and humanity. The rainbow was a beautiful sign, a symbol of hope, a promise that the earth would never again be destroyed by flood. Every time rain fell and the sun shone through the drops, creating that arc of colors in the sky, it would be a reminder of God's mercy. Noah and his family began their new life. They were the only humans left on Earth. Every other person had died in the flood. The responsibility of repopulating the entire world rested on their shoulders. They started farming. Noah planted a vineyard. He cultivated crops. They built homes. They established a new community. Life began again. The animals spread across the earth. They found new territories. They adapted to different environments. They multiplied and filled various regions. Birds nested in trees. Fish swam in the rivers and seas. Wild animals roamed the plains and mountains. From Noah's 3 sons, Shem, Ham, and Japheth, all the peoples of the earth descended. Every nation, every tribe, every ethnic group can trace their ancestry back to these 3 men and their wives. All of humanity comes from this one family that survived the flood. The flood had cleansed the earth of wickedness. It had given the world a fresh start. But it hadn't changed human nature. People still had the capacity for both good and evil. They still had to choose whether to follow God or reject Him. The story of Noah and the ark is one of the most famous stories in the Bible. It has been told and retold for thousands of years. It appears in ancient texts and traditions from many cultures around the world. Different versions exist, but the biblical account is the most detailed and well-known. This story teaches several important lessons. First, it shows that God takes sin seriously. He doesn't ignore wickedness. He doesn't overlook evil. The flood demonstrated that there are consequences for rejecting God and choosing evil. God's patience has limits. Second, it shows that God is merciful. Even though the whole world deserved judgment, God saved one family. He preserved Noah and his household. He gave humanity another chance. He didn't completely destroy the human race. Third, it shows the importance of faith and obedience. Noah believed God even when it seemed impossible. He obeyed God even when others mocked him. He worked for decades on a project that must have seemed crazy. His faith saved his life. Fourth, it shows that God keeps His promises. God said He would send a flood, and He did. God said He would save Noah, and He did. God said He would never again destroy the earth with a flood, and He has kept that promise for thousands of years. The rainbow remains a symbol of hope and promise. Every time we see one, we can remember that God is faithful, that He keeps His word, that He offers mercy to those who trust in Him. People throughout history have wondered about the flood. Did it really happen? Where is the ark now? Many have searched for evidence. There are flood stories in many ancient cultures. The Babylonians had a flood story. The ancient Sumerians had one. Cultures from around the world have traditions about a great flood that destroyed the earth. This suggests that some major flooding event may have affected early human civilizations. Some people have searched for Noah's Ark on Mount Ararat in Turkey. Various explorers have claimed to find wooden structures high on the mountain. But none of these claims have been definitively proven. The harsh conditions on the mountain make thorough investigation difficult. Whether we can find physical evidence or not, the story has had enormous impact. It has influenced art, literature, and culture for thousands of years. It has shaped how people think about God, judgment, and mercy. Noah lived 350 years after the flood. He lived to be 950 years old in total. He saw his descendants multiply. He saw the world repopulated. He saw humanity spread across the earth. Noah witnessed the fulfillment of God's command to be fruitful and multiply. He saw his sons have children, and those children have children. He lived long enough to see many generations of his descendants. The Bible honors Noah as a man of faith. In the New Testament, Noah is mentioned as an example of righteousness. He is listed among the heroes of faith. His trust in God, his obedience, and his righteousness made him stand out in a wicked generation. Noah's story reminds us that one person can make a difference. One faithful person in a corrupt world caught God's attention. One family living rightly was worth saving. One man's obedience preserved the future of humanity. The ark itself was a symbol of salvation. Just as Noah and his family were saved by entering the ark, people throughout history have understood that we need God's salvation. We need to be rescued from the consequences of sin. We need to trust in God's provision for our protection. The story of Noah challenges us to think about our own lives. What would we have done in Noah's time? Would we have been among those who mocked him, or would we have listened to his warnings? The people of Noah's time had plenty of warning. They saw the ark being built for decades. They heard Noah preaching. They had chances to repent. But they chose not to believe. They continued in their evil ways until it was too late. This reminds us that opportunities don't last forever. There comes a time when the door closes. When God sealed the ark, that was it. No one else could enter. The time for salvation had passed. But the story also reminds us that God's patience is long. He didn't destroy the earth immediately when wickedness appeared. He waited. He gave people time to change. He sent a preacher to warn them. He provided a way of escape through the ark. The flood also reminds us that physical death is not the end of the story. The people who died in the flood faced eternal consequences. Their rejection of God in this life affected their eternal destiny. The story points to spiritual realities beyond physical survival. The flood story fits into the larger story of the Bible. It comes early in human history. After creation, after the fall of Adam and Eve, after Cain killed Abel, after generations of increasing wickedness, comes the flood. The flood represented a kind of reset, a cleansing, a new beginning. But it wasn't the final answer to the problem of human sin. That would require something greater. Later in the Bible, Jesus Christ is presented as the ultimate answer to human sinfulness. Where the flood showed God's judgment on sin, Jesus showed God's love and mercy. Jesus provided a way for people to be saved, not from physical destruction, but from eternal separation from God. The New Testament draws a parallel between Noah's time and the end times. Jesus said that as it was in the days of Noah, so it will be when he returns. People were eating and drinking, marrying and being given in marriage, unaware of the coming judgment. They didn't realize what was happening until the flood came and swept them all away. Jesus used Noah as a warning. He said that his return would be similar. Life would seem normal. People would be going about their daily business. And then suddenly, unexpectedly, judgment would come. Just as people in Noah's time were unprepared despite all the warnings, people in the future would be unprepared for Christ's return. The Apostle Peter also wrote about the flood. He explained that the world that existed before the flood was destroyed by water. But he said the present world is reserved for fire. It is being kept for judgment and destruction of ungodly people. Peter used the flood to remind people that God does judge sin, that judgment is real, that people should take warnings seriously. But Peter also emphasized God's patience. He explained that God is patient because he wants everyone to come to repentance. He doesn't want anyone to perish. Just as God gave people in Noah's time opportunities to repent, God gives people today opportunities to turn to him. Let's think more carefully about the practical aspects of life on the ark. How did Noah and his family actually manage thousands of animals for over a year? The ark was huge by ancient standards, but it still had limited space. Researchers have calculated that the ark's volume was equivalent to about 450 standard livestock train cars. That's substantial space. The 3 decks provided about 100,000 square feet of floor space. But how many animals were actually on board? The Bible says 2 of every kind and 7 pairs of clean animals. The word kind is important here. It probably doesn't mean every species we recognize today. It more likely means broader categories. For example, Noah didn't need every breed of dog. He needed representatives of the dog kind. From those representatives, all modern dog breeds could eventually develop. The same would apply to cats, horses, cattle, and other animal groups. Cut. Young animals would take less space than adults. They would eat less. They would be easier to manage. Perhaps God brought juvenile animals to the ark rather than full-grown adults. This would make sense practically. As for caring for them, Noah's family of 8 people would need an efficient system. They probably fed animals once or twice a day. Many animals can go extended periods without food. Some animals may have hibernated during the voyage, requiring little care. Waste removal was a significant challenge. Some people suggest the ark may have had a system of sloped floors and drainage. Waste could have been channeled to collection areas and periodically removed through hatches. Others suggest straw or other materials absorbed waste until it could be cleaned. Water collection from rain would help provide drinking water for the animals. The rain that fell for 40 days could have been channeled and stored. This would supplement whatever water was initially brought aboard. The work was certainly exhausting, but it was manageable for 8 dedicated people working together. They had no other responsibilities. Their entire focus was keeping themselves and the animals alive. When Noah emerged from the ark, he saw a completely different world. The flood had radically altered the landscape. Understanding these changes helps us appreciate what Noah experienced. Before the flood, the earth's surface was different. Mountains may have been less tall. Valleys may have been less deep. The Bible mentions that the springs of the great deep burst forth, suggesting underground water reservoirs broke open. This would have caused massive geological upheaval. The violent floodwaters would have eroded surfaces rapidly. Sediment would have been deposited in thick layers. Whole forests would have been uprooted and buried. Animals and plants would have been covered quickly by mud and debris. This could explain fossil beds, where many creatures are buried together. The ocean basins may have sunk lower, allowing water to drain from the land. Mountain ranges may have risen higher as tectonic plates shifted. The Earth's geography was reshaped dramatically. The climate may have changed too. Before the flood, conditions may have been more uniform across the planet. After the flood, we see the development of distinct climate zones. Ice ages may have followed as the Earth's systems adjusted to new conditions. Noah and his family had to adapt to this new world. They had to find suitable places to live. They had to learn what plants were safe to eat. They had to navigate unfamiliar terrain. Everything they had known was gone. Emotional and psychological impact. We often focus on the physical aspects of Noah's story, but what about the emotional and psychological impact? What was it like for Noah and his family mentally and emotionally? Noah had spent decades being mocked and ridiculed. He had been called crazy. His life's work had been dismissed as foolish. That must have been difficult. He had to maintain faith despite constant opposition. When the flood came, Noah was vindicated. But that vindication came at a terrible cost. Everyone he had tried to warn perished. His neighbors, distant relatives, people he had known his whole life, all died. The screams of drowning people must have haunted the family inside the ark. Noah's family may have experienced survivor's guilt. Why were they saved when everyone else died? What made them special? This weight of being the only survivors could have been psychologically crushing. Living in the ark for over a year was its own challenge. Confined spaces, constant work, no privacy, the stress of responsibility. They couldn't escape each other. They had to work together constantly. Family tensions must have developed. After leaving the ark, they faced the trauma of seeing a destroyed world. Empty cities. No other people. The silence must have been eerie. The loneliness profound. They were starting completely over. They also carried the responsibility of repopulating the earth. The future of humanity depended on them having children and those children having children. That's enormous pressure. Yet through all this, Noah remained faithful. He worshiped God immediately after leaving the ark. He didn't become bitter. He didn't blame God. He recognized that God had saved him and his family. He responded with gratitude. Noah's 3 sons, Shem, Ham, and Japheth, became the fathers of all future humanity. Each son's descendants populated different regions of the world. From Japheth came peoples who settled in regions to the north and west. His descendants spread across areas we might recognize today as Europe and parts of Asia. The Greeks, Romans, and other Mediterranean peoples traced ancestry through Japheth's line. From Ham came peoples who settled in Africa and parts of the Middle East. His descendants included the Egyptians, Ethiopians, and various Canaanite peoples. These nations played important roles in later biblical history. From Shem came the Semitic peoples. This included the Hebrews, from whom came the nation of Israel. Through Shem's line came Abraham, and eventually, according to Christian belief, Jesus Christ himself. The Arabs also traced their ancestry through Shem. As these families grew and multiplied, they began to spread out. They moved to different areas seeking land and resources. They established settlements that grew into villages, then towns, then cities. Languages developed and diversified. Different cultures emerged. Various traditions formed. The unity of Noah's immediate family gave way to the diversity of human civilization. Yet all these diverse peoples shared a common origin. They all descended from one man and his 3 sons. This common ancestry means all humans are related. We are all part of one human family. After the flood, Noah lived 350 more years. That's longer than most complete human lifetimes today. Noah witnessed incredible changes during those centuries. He saw the world repopulate. He saw his grandchildren and great-grandchildren and many more generations beyond. His family tree expanded exponentially. From 8 people to hundreds, then thousands, then tens of thousands. Noah experienced the formation of new cultures. He saw different languages develop. He watched as humanity began rebuilding civilization. Cities were founded. Agriculture expanded. Technology developed. But Noah also saw that the flood hadn't eliminated human sinfulness. People were still capable of evil. They still made wrong choices. They still turned away from God. The cleansing of the earth hadn't changed human nature. The Bible records one troubling incident from Noah's later life. After planting his vineyard, Noah made wine and became drunk. While in this state, something inappropriate happened involving his son Ham. The exact details are unclear, but it resulted in Noah cursing Ham's son Canaan. This story reminds us that even heroes of faith are flawed humans. Noah was righteous compared to his generation. He walked with God. But he wasn't perfect. He made mistakes. He had weaknesses. Yet God still used Noah for his purposes. God's work doesn't depend on finding perfect people. It depends on finding faithful people who, despite their flaws, trust God and obey him. Noah died at age 950. He had lived nearly a millennium. He had seen the world destroyed and rebuilt. He had witnessed the worst of human evil and experienced God's gracious salvation. His life spanned an era of human history unlike any other. Not long after Noah's time, another significant event occurred. Humanity came together to build a great city and tower. This was the Tower of Babel. The people said, "Come, let us build ourselves a city with a tower that reaches to the heavens, so that we may make a name for ourselves." They wanted to stay together in one place. They wanted to build something impressive. They wanted to establish their own greatness. But God had commanded humanity to spread out and fill the earth. By staying in one place, they were disobeying God's instruction. By trying to make a name for themselves, they were acting in pride. God confused their language. Suddenly, people couldn't understand each other. Those who spoke the same new language grouped together. They separated from those who spoke different languages. The people scattered across the earth, just as God had intended. This scattering accelerated the formation of distinct nations and cultures. It ensured that humanity would spread across the globe rather than concentrating in one location. The story of Babel shows that even after the flood's judgment, humans continued to struggle with pride and disobedience. The problem of sin persisted. New solutions would be needed. The story of Noah speaks to people in every generation. What can we learn from it today? First, we learn about the importance of standing firm in our convictions. Noah believed God even when everyone around him thought he was wrong. He didn't let popular opinion change his actions. He remained faithful despite mockery and opposition. In our world, we often face pressure to compromise our beliefs, to go along with what everyone else is doing, to be silent about our faith. Noah's example encourages us to stand firm. Second, we learn about the value of preparation. Noah spent decades preparing for the flood. When it came, he was ready. He had done what God commanded. We too should prepare for what's coming. Not by building physical arks, but by preparing our hearts, by building our faith, by establishing our relationship with God, by living in obedience to Him. Third, we learn about the importance of family. Noah didn't just save himself, he brought his family with him. His faith protected his household. Our faith affects those around us. Our choices impact our families. When we follow God, we create opportunities for those we love to be saved as well. Fourth, we learn that God's patience has limits, but His mercy is great. God waited a long time before sending the flood. He gave people many chances to repent, but eventually, judgment came. God is patient today too. He gives people time to turn to Him. But that time won't last forever. We shouldn't presume on God's patience. Fifth, we learn that salvation requires entering through the door God provides. The ark had one door. Everyone who was saved went through that door. Those who didn't enter perished. Christians believe Jesus is like that door. He said, "I am the way and the truth and the life. No one comes to the Father except through me." Just as people in Noah's time needed to enter the ark, people today need to come to God through Jesus. The flood story is ultimately a story of hope. Yes, it involves terrible judgment. Yes, it describes devastating destruction. But at its heart, it's about God's commitment to humanity. God could have simply destroyed everything and started over with new creatures. He could have given up on humanity entirely. But He didn't. He preserved Noah and his family. He gave the human race another chance. This shows God's love for humanity. Despite our sinfulness, despite our rebellion, despite how much we disappoint Him, God doesn't abandon us. He works to save us. He provides a way of escape. The rainbow is a symbol of this hope. Every time we see those colors arcing across the sky, we're reminded that God keeps His promises, that He is merciful, that He offers new beginnings. The flood washed away the old world and made way for the new. In a similar way, God offers to wash away our old lives and give us new ones, to cleanse us from sin and give us fresh starts. This story reminds us our actions matter, that our choices have consequences, that we can't live however we want without facing results. But it also reminds us that God sees the faithful, that He rewards those who trust Him, that He saves those who obey Him. God used water to test Noah's faith. But in another time and place, He used fire to test 3 Hebrew men. Just as Noah stood firm in a world that mocked him, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego stood firm before a king who demanded their worship. So what happened? In the land of Judah, there lived a people who worshiped the one true God. They were descendants of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. God had chosen them as His special people. He had given them laws to follow. He had promised to protect them if they remained faithful. But the people of Judah had not remained faithful. Generation after generation, they had turned away from God. They had worshipped false idols. They had broken God's commandments. They had ignored the warnings of prophets whom God had sent to them. God had been patient. He had given them many chances to return to Him, but they continued in their disobedience. They continued in their rebellion. Finally, God's patience reached its limit. God allowed a powerful empire to conquer Judah. This empire was Babylon. Babylon was the superpower of the ancient world. Its armies were fierce and well-trained, Its king was ambitious and ruthless. Its capital city was magnificent and terrifying. In the year 605 BC, the Babylonian army marched into Judah. King Nebuchadnezzar led his forces. They surrounded Jerusalem, the capital city of Judah. The city was strong, but Babylon was stronger. Jerusalem could not resist. King Nebuchadnezzar decided not to destroy Jerusalem completely. Not yet. Instead, he chose a different strategy. He would take the best and brightest people from Judah back to Babylon. He would force them to serve him. He would use their talents for his own empire. The Babylonian soldiers rounded up the young men of noble families. They took princes and aristocrats. They selected those who were educated and intelligent. They chose the strongest and healthiest. These young men were torn from their homes and families. They were marched hundreds of miles across the desert to a foreign land. Among these captives were 4 young men whose story would echo through the ages. Their Hebrew names were Hananiah, Mishael, Azariah, and Daniel. These 4 friends came from good families in Jerusalem. They had been raised to worship God. They had been taught God's laws. They knew the stories of their ancestors. Now they were prisoners, exiles, foreigners in a strange land. Everything they had known was gone. Their comfortable lives had ended. Their futures were uncertain. They were completely at the mercy of a pagan king who did not know their God. The journey to Babylon was long and difficult. The young captives walked for weeks across harsh terrain. The desert sun beat down on them. Their feet became sore and blistered. They were given just enough food and water to survive. Some grew sick along the way. Others despaired. But finally, they arrived at Babylon, and what they saw must have taken their breath away. Babylon was unlike anything they had ever seen. Jerusalem had been impressive, but Babylon was magnificent beyond imagination. The city walls were so thick that chariots could race on top of them. The walls stretched for miles, encircling the entire city. The famous Ishtar Gate greeted visitors to the city. It was covered in brilliant blue tiles. Golden images of dragons and bulls decorated its surface. It sparkled in the sunlight. It proclaimed Babylon's wealth and power. Inside the city, massive temples rose toward the sky. Ziggurats, they were called. These were stepped pyramids where the Babylonians worshipped their gods. The largest was dedicated to Marduk, the chief god of Babylon. Palaces sprawled across vast areas. Gardens hung from terraces. These were the famous hanging gardens, one of the wonders of the ancient world. Water flowed through channels to irrigate exotic plants. Trees and flowers from distant lands grew in the heart of the city. Streets bustled with activity. Merchants sold goods from across the known world. Soldiers marched in formation. Priests in elaborate robes performed rituals. Slaves hurried about their tasks. The air filled with unfamiliar sounds. Strange languages mixed together. Foreign music played. The smell of incense and spices was everywhere. For the young Hebrew captives, it was overwhelming. This was not their home. These were not their people. This was not their God being worshipped. They were strangers in a strange land. They were exiles far from everything they loved. King Nebuchadnezzar had specific plans for the young captives from Judah. He wanted to use their talents. He wanted to mold them into servants who would be useful to his empire. But first, they needed training. The king appointed an official named Ashpenaz to oversee the program. Ashpenaz was the chief of the king's court officials. His job was to select the most promising young men from among the captives. Then he would train them for service in the royal palace. The selection criteria were strict. The young men had to be without any physical defect. They had to be handsome. They needed to show aptitude for learning. They should be well informed. They should be quick to understand. They should be qualified to serve in the king's palace. Ashpenaz chose carefully. He examined the young captives. He tested them. He asked them questions. He assessed their abilities. From all the captives, he selected a smaller group who met the requirements. Among those selected were the four friends, Hananiah, Mishael, Azariah, and Daniel. They had all the qualities Ashpenaz was looking for. They were healthy and strong. They were intelligent and educated. They showed promise. But selection was only the beginning. Now came the training, and this training would last for 3 years. The king ordered that these young men should be taught the language of the Babylonians. Hebrew was their native tongue. Now they needed to learn Akkadian, the language of Babylon. They needed to read it, write it, and speak it fluently. They were to be taught Babylonian literature. This included the epics and myths of Babylon, stories about Babylonian gods and heroes, poetry and wisdom literature, historical records, legal texts. They needed to learn Babylonian science. The Babylonians were advanced in mathematics and astronomy. They had sophisticated understanding of the stars and planets. They could predict eclipses. They tracked celestial movements. The young men needed to master these subjects. They were taught magic and divination. The Babylonians believed they could read omens in the flight of birds, the patterns of oil in water, and the organs of sacrificed animals. They consulted spirits and performed rituals. The young Hebrew men were expected to learn these practices too. The king also decreed that these young men should be given food from his own table. They would eat the same rich foods that the king ate. They would drink the same fine wine. This was considered a great honor. Royal food was the best available. It showed the king's favor. For 3 years, the young men would undergo this intensive training. At the end, they would be presented to King Nebuchadnezzar. He would examine them personally. Those who proved themselves would enter royal service. Those who failed would be sent away or worse. One of the first things Ashpenaz did was give the young men new names. This was a deliberate strategy. Names were important in the ancient world. They carried meaning. They reflected identity. By changing their names, the Babylonians were trying to change who these young men were. Hananiah was given the Babylonian name Shadrach. His Hebrew name meant Yahweh is gracious. Yahweh was the name of the God of Israel. Hananiah's name was a constant reminder of God's grace. But his new name, Shadrach, likely honored a Babylonian god. The meaning was tied to Babylonian religion. Mishael became Meshach. His Hebrew name meant who is like God. It was a declaration that the God of Israel was unique and supreme. No one compared to him. But Meshach, his Babylonian name, again connected to Babylonian deities. Azariah was renamed Abednego. Azariah meant Yahweh has helped in Hebrew. It testified to God's faithfulness. But Abednego meant servant of Nego, likely referring to the Babylonian god Nabu. Their friend Daniel received the name Belteshazzar. Daniel meant God is my judge in Hebrew. Belteshazzar meant Bel protects his life in Babylonian. Bel was another name for Marduk, the chief Babylonian god. Do you see what was happening? The Babylonians were systematically trying to erase these young men's Hebrew identity. They were trying to make them forget who they were. They were trying to make them Babylonian in thought, word, and deed. Every time someone called them by their new names, it was a reminder that they served Babylon now, that they belonged to Nebuchadnezzar, that their old lives were gone, that their Hebrew God was far away. But these 4 young men did not forget who they were. They remembered the God of their fathers. They held on to their faith, even as everything around them pushed them to abandon it. For the sake of this story, we'll call them by their Babylonian names, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. These are the names by which they became famous. These are the names recorded in Scripture. The training program presented constant challenges to the young men's faith. Every day brought new pressures to conform to Babylonian culture. Every lesson threatened to pull them away from the God of Israel. They were surrounded by idolatry. Everywhere they looked, they saw images of false gods. Statues of Marduk, Ishtar, Nabu, and other Babylonian deities filled the city. People bowed before these images. They offered sacrifices. They prayed to lifeless stone and metal. The young Hebrew men knew this was wrong. The second commandment was clear: you shall not make for yourself an idol in the form of anything in heaven above, or on the earth beneath, or in the waters below. You shall not bow down to them or worship them. Yet they were being taught that these Babylonian gods were real and powerful, that they controlled nature and destiny, that they should be honored and feared. The pressure to accept this worldview was immense. They were learning magic and divination. But the God of Israel had forbidden such practices. The law of Moses strictly prohibited consulting mediums and spiritists. Divination was an abomination to God. Yet here they were, required to study these very things. How could they learn about these practices without participating in them? How could they understand Babylonian religion without embracing it? This was the tightrope they had to walk. The richest food from the king's table was set before them daily. For most people, this would be a blessing. Royal food was the finest available. It represented privilege and honor. But for these young Hebrew men, it presented a problem. Some of the king's food would have been unclean according to Jewish law. Pork was forbidden. Certain seafoods were not allowed. Animals that weren't slaughtered properly couldn't be eaten. Additionally, food from the king's table would have been offered to idols first. Babylonians regularly dedicated food to their gods before eating it. To eat such food would be to participate, even indirectly, in idol worship. Daniel took the lead among the four friends. He decided he would not defile himself with the royal food and wine. He made up his mind. He drew a line. There were some compromises he simply would not make. He approached Ashpenaz with a request. Could they please be excused from eating the king's food? Could they eat vegetables and drink water instead? Ashpenaz liked Daniel. The Bible says God had caused Ashpenaz to show favor and sympathy to Daniel. But Ashpenaz was afraid. He said, "I am afraid of my lord the king, who has assigned your food and drink. Why should he see you looking worse than the other young men your age? The king would then have my head because of you." This was a real fear. Nebuchadnezzar was not known for his patience with failure. If the Hebrew young men looked unhealthy, the king would blame Ashpenaz. The consequences would be severe. Daniel understood the fear. So he proposed a test. "Please test your servants for 10 days. Give us nothing but vegetables to eat and water to drink. Then compare our appearance with that of the young men who eat the royal food. See for yourself, and then treat us accordingly." The official agreed to try this experiment. For 10 days, Daniel, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego ate only vegetables and drank only water. The other young men continued eating from the king's table. At the end of 10 days, the results were clear. Daniel and his 3 friends looked healthier and better nourished than all the young men who ate the royal food. Their appearance was better. They showed no signs of weakness or deficiency. God had honored their faithfulness. He had blessed their obedience. They had refused to defile themselves, and God had taken care of them. From that point on, the guard allowed them to continue their simple diet. They ate vegetables and drank water while the others ate rich foods. And they thrived on it. The 3 years of training continued. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego studied hard. They learned the Babylonian language. They mastered Babylonian literature. They understood the science and mathematics. They absorbed everything they were taught. But they filtered it all through their faith in God. They learned about Babylonian gods but didn't worship them. They studied divination but didn't practice it. They understood the culture but didn't adopt its values. The Bible tells us that God gave these 4 young men knowledge and understanding of all kinds of literature and learning. God blessed their studies. He enhanced their natural abilities. He gave them wisdom beyond their years. Daniel received a special gift. God gave him understanding of visions and dreams of all kinds. This ability would prove crucial in the years ahead. It would open doors. It would save lives. It would demonstrate God's power in Babylon. The 3 years passed. Finally, the time came for the young men to be presented to King Nebuchadnezzar. This was the moment of reckoning. This would determine their futures. Ashpenaz brought all the young men before the king. Nebuchadnezzar examined them personally. He talked with them. He tested their knowledge. He assessed their abilities. He evaluated their potential. The Bible records that he found no one equal to Daniel, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. These four stood out from all the others. They excelled in every area. Their understanding was deeper. Their wisdom was greater. Their abilities were superior. The king talked with them about many matters. He asked questions requiring wisdom and understanding. In every case, he found these four men 10 times better than all the magicians and enchanters in his whole kingdom. 10 times better. They weren't just slightly above average. They were extraordinarily gifted. Nebuchadnezzar was impressed. He appointed them to positions in his service. They entered the royal court. They became advisors and officials. They had access to the king. They had influence and authority. But they had achieved all this without compromising their faith. They had succeeded in a pagan culture while remaining faithful to God. They had learned Babylon's wisdom without adopting Babylon's religion. They had become powerful in a foreign land without forgetting who they were. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego served in Nebuchadnezzar's administration for years. They proved themselves capable and trustworthy. They handled their responsibilities well. The king came to rely on them. Their friend Daniel rose to an even higher position. Through his God-given ability to interpret dreams, Daniel became one of the most powerful men in Babylon. He was made ruler over the entire province of Babylon and placed in charge of all its wise men. Daniel requested that Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego be appointed administrators over the province of Babylon. The king granted this request. So these three friends were given significant governmental responsibilities. They oversaw important affairs of the province. They managed resources and people. They made decisions that affected many lives. Think about their situation. They were foreign captives who had risen to positions of power. They were Hebrews governing in a Babylonian empire. They were worshippers of the true God serving a king who worshipped false gods. They were far from home but faithful to their heritage. Their success must have caused some jealousy among the native Babylonians. Why should these foreigners have such positions? Why should these Jews have such influence? Some people surely resented them. Others were looking for opportunities to bring them down. But Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego conducted themselves with integrity. They were honest in their dealings. They were fair in their judgments. They were diligent in their work. Their enemies couldn't find legitimate grounds for accusation. Still, these three men faced constant tension. They lived in a culture that contradicted their beliefs. They served a king who claimed divine status. They were surrounded by idolatry and paganism. Every day required careful navigation between their duties and their faith. They had found ways to be faithful in most areas. They ate food that didn't violate their convictions. They served in government without participating in idolatry. They advised the king without compromising their values. They had learned to be in Babylon but not of Babylon. But a crisis was coming. A situation would arise that would test their faith like never before. A moment would come when compromise would be impossible. They would have to choose between their lives and their loyalty to God. One day, King Nebuchadnezzar conceived an ambitious project. He decided to build a massive image made of gold. This would be a statue unlike any other, a monument to power and glory. The image would be enormous, 90 feet high and 9 feet wide. That's as tall as a 9-story building. It would tower over the plain where it stood. It would be visible from miles away. It would proclaim Nebuchadnezzar's greatness to everyone who saw it. The Bible doesn't tell us exactly what the image represented. Some scholars think it was an image of Nebuchadnezzar himself, the king claiming divine status. Others think it was an image of a Babylonian god, perhaps Marduk. Either way, it was an object of worship. The image was set up on the plain of Dura in the province of Babylon. Workers constructed it according to the king's specifications. Gold covered its surface. In the bright Middle Eastern sun, it must have gleamed brilliantly. It was designed to be impressive, and it succeeded. When the image was complete, Nebuchadnezzar called for a dedication ceremony. But this wasn't going to be a small, private affair. The king summoned all the high officials of the provinces. Everyone important in the Babylonian Empire was required to attend. The summons went out across the land. The satraps were called. These were the governors of large territories. The prefects came. These were military commanders. The governors of smaller regions arrived. The advisors, treasurers, judges, magistrates, and all the other provincial officials made their way to the plain of Dura. This was a massive gathering of power. All the important people in the empire assembled in one place. They came from distant provinces. They traveled for days or weeks. They couldn't refuse the king's summons. Not without consequences. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego were required to attend. As administrators over the province of Babylon, they were among the high officials. Their presence was expected. Their absence would be noticed. The officials assembled before the image. They stood in the shadow of the massive golden statue. They waited for the ceremony to begin. The atmosphere was tense with anticipation. What would the king require of them? A herald stepped forward. He was the king's official spokesman. His voice rang out across the plain. He made an announcement that everyone could hear. "This is what you are commanded to do, O peoples, nations, and men of every language. As soon as you hear the sound of the horn, flute, zither, lyre, harp, pipes, and all kinds of music, you must fall down and worship the image of gold that King Nebuchadnezzar has set up." The command was clear. When the music started, everyone must bow down. Everyone must worship the image. There would be no exceptions, no exemptions, no excuses. But the herald wasn't finished. He continued with a dire warning. Whoever does not fall down and worship will immediately be thrown into a blazing furnace. The threat was explicit. Disobedience meant death. And not just any death. A horrible, agonizing death by fire. The blazing furnace stood nearby. Its flames were visible. Its heat could be felt. This was not an empty threat. Think about what Nebuchadnezzar was doing. He was demanding absolute obedience. He was requiring everyone to participate in an act of worship. He was using the threat of death to enforce compliance. He was turning religious observance into a political test of loyalty. This was totalitarianism at its finest. Worship the image or die. Submit to the king's will or be destroyed. There was no middle ground, no room for conscience, no respect for personal belief. For most of the assembled officials, this presented no problem. They were pagans anyway. Bowing to another god or image was no big deal. Babylonians were polytheistic. They worshipped many gods. Adding another act of worship to their lives didn't trouble their consciences. But for Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, this was different. This was a direct violation of God's law. This was exactly what they had been taught never to do. This crossed a line they couldn't cross. The first commandment said, "You shall have no other gods before me." The second commandment said, "You shall not make for yourself an idol. You shall not bow down to them or worship them." These commands weren't suggestions. They weren't flexible guidelines. They were absolute requirements. The God of Israel demanded exclusive worship. He would not share his glory with false gods or man-made images. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego faced an impossible situation. If they bowed down, they would betray their God. They would violate the core of their faith. They would deny everything they believed. But if they refused to bow down, they would die. Horribly, publicly, painfully. The furnace was ready. The executioners were waiting. There would be no mercy. What would they do? The musicians took their positions. They held their instruments ready. Horns, flutes, zithars, lyres, harps, pipes, and other instruments. An entire orchestra. When they played, the sound would be unmistakable. Everyone would hear it. Everyone would know it was time. The herald gave the signal. The music began. The sound swelled across the plain, multiple instruments playing in harmony. A grand, impressive sound, designed to inspire awe, calculated to create a sense of occasion and importance. As soon as the music started, the officials responded. Thousands of people fell to their knees. They prostrated themselves before the golden image. They bowed low, face to the ground, in submission and worship. From a distance, it must have looked like a wave sweeping through the crowd. Everyone going down together. A synchronized display of obedience. A demonstration of Nebuchadnezzar's absolute power. But 3 men remained standing. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego did not bow down. While everyone around them fell to the ground, they stood upright. While thousands worshipped the image, they refused. While the entire crowd complied, they resisted. They stood tall and straight. They kept their eyes forward. They did not kneel. They did not bow. They did not worship. This wasn't a secret rebellion. This wasn't a subtle resistance. They were standing in the middle of a crowd of kneeling people. They were visible. They were obvious. They were unmistakable. Their refusal was bold. It was courageous. It was dangerous. It was a public declaration that they would not compromise, that some things were more important than life itself, that their loyalty to God came before everything else. Think about the pressure they felt. Everyone else was bowing. The music was playing. The king was watching. The furnace was burning. Every natural instinct would scream at them to just bow down, to save themselves, to go along with the crowd. They could have rationalized it. It doesn't mean anything. God knows our hearts. We're not really worshiping the image. We're just following orders. It's just a physical act. We can bow on the outside while remaining faithful on the inside. But they didn't rationalize. They didn't compromise. They didn't pretend. They stood firm in their convictions. They chose faithfulness over survival. Of course, their defiance was noticed immediately. How could it not be? 3 men standing while everyone else kneeled. It was impossible to miss. Some of the Babylonian officials saw them. These men were astrologers. They were part of the class of wise men who served the king. They were colleagues of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, perhaps rivals, perhaps jealous of the Hebrews' success and influence. These astrologers saw an opportunity. They could rid themselves of these foreign competitors. They could bring down these Jews who had risen so high. They could win favor with the king by reporting disobedience. They approached King Nebuchadnezzar. They came to him with their accusation. But notice how they framed it. They were clever in their presentation. First, they praised the king. "O King Nebuchadnezzar, live forever." They showed respect. They acknowledged his authority. They buttered him up. Then they reminded him of his decree. "You have issued a decree, O king, that everyone who hears the sound of the horn, flute, zither, lyre, harp, pipes, and all kinds of music must fall down and worship the image of gold, and that whoever does not fall down and worship will be thrown into a blazing furnace." They made sure the king remembered his own words, his own command, his own threat. They established the legal framework for their accusation. Then they made it personal. They appealed to the king's pride and anger. "But there are some Jews whom you have set in charge of the affairs of the province of Babylon. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. They pay no attention to you, O king." Notice the rhetoric. Some Jews. They emphasized the men's foreign status. These weren't loyal Babylonians. These were outsiders, foreigners, different, whom you have set in charge. They reminded the king that he had elevated these men. He had given them power and position, and now they were betraying his trust. They pay no attention to you, O king. This was about disrespect, about defiance, about rebellion against royal authority. Then they detailed the specifics. They neither serve your gods nor worship the image of gold you have set up. The accusation was complete. These 3 Hebrew men had violated the king's decree. They had refused to worship. They had disobeyed publicly. They had shown contempt for the king's authority. The astrologers had framed this perfectly. They made it about loyalty and respect. They made it about the king's honor. They made it impossible for Nebuchadnezzar to ignore without looking weak. When Nebuchadnezzar heard this report, he was furious. The Bible says he was furious with rage. This wasn't mild displeasure. This was intense, consuming anger. Think about why he was so angry. He was the most powerful man in the world. Kings and nations trembled at his name. His word was law. His command was absolute. No one defied him. No one dared. And yet these 3 men, whom he had personally elevated to positions of authority, had publicly refused to obey his decree. They had embarrassed him in front of all his officials. They had challenged his power. They had set a dangerous example. If he let this go unpunished, what message would that send? That the king's commands could be ignored. That people could pick and choose which decrees to obey. That foreign captives had rights that trumped royal authority. Nebuchadnezzar couldn't allow that. His entire system of government depended on absolute obedience. Any hint of weakness would invite rebellion. Any mercy shown to these men would be seen as vulnerability. But Nebuchadnezzar was also puzzled. He had trusted these men. He had promoted them. They had served him faithfully for years. Why would they suddenly defy him like this? What could possibly be worth their lives? He decided to give them a chance to explain. He summoned Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego to appear before him. He wanted to hear from them directly. Perhaps there was some misunderstanding. Perhaps they hadn't heard the decree properly. Perhaps they deserved a chance to comply. The 3 men were brought before the king. They stood in his presence. The furnace burned nearby. The threat was real and immediate. One word from the king, and they would be thrown into the flames. Nebuchadnezzar looked at them. He spoke with barely controlled rage. "Is it true, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, that you do not serve my gods or worship the image of gold I have set up?" He gave them a chance to answer, to explain, to defend themselves. But he was already convinced of their guilt. The question was rhetorical. He knew they had refused. Then, surprisingly, he offered them a second chance. His anger was tempered with a sliver of mercy. Perhaps he didn't want to execute these capable administrators. Perhaps he hoped they would recant. Now, when you hear the sound of the horn, flute, zither, lyre, harp, pipes, and all kinds of music, if you are ready to fall down and worship the image I made, very good. He would let them try again. He would repeat the test. If they bowed this time, all would be forgiven. They could return to their positions. Life could continue as before. But if you do not worship it, you will be thrown immediately into a blazing furnace. The threat was repeated, made explicit, made immediate. This was their last chance. Comply or die. There would be no third opportunity. Then Nebuchadnezzar added something revealing. Something that showed his pride and his complete misunderstanding of who these men were and what they believed. Then what God will be able to rescue you from my hand. This was the ultimate expression of arrogance. Nebuchadnezzar believed he was more powerful than any god. He thought no deity could stand against him. He assumed his authority was absolute and final. He had thrown down a challenge not just to 3 men, but to their God. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego heard the king's offer. They heard the threat. They heard the challenge to their God. Now they had to respond. This was the moment of decision. They could still save themselves. They could still bow down. The king had given them another chance. All they had to do was compromise this one time. But they didn't hesitate. They didn't ask for time to think. They didn't request a private consultation. They answered immediately. Their response was clear, bold, and unforgettable. "O Nebuchadnezzar, we do not need to defend ourselves before you in this matter." They weren't going to make excuses. They weren't going to apologize. They weren't going to explain or justify. Their position was simple and required no defense. Then they made one of the greatest declarations of faith ever recorded. "If we are thrown into the blazing furnace, the God we serve is able to save us from it, and he will rescue us from your hand, O king." This was a statement of absolute confidence in God's power. They believed God could save them. They had no doubt about his ability. The furnace held no terror for them because they trusted in God's strength. But then they added something even more remarkable. "But even if he does not, we want you to know, O king, that we will not serve your gods or worship the image of gold you have set up." This is the heart of true faith. They believed God could save them, but even if he chose not to, they would still obey him. Even if faithfulness led to death, they would remain faithful. Their obedience wasn't conditional on deliverance. They weren't bargaining with God. They weren't worshiping him only because they expected rescue. They were saying, "God can save us. We believe he will save us, but if he doesn't, if he allows us to die, we'll still not bow down. We'll still not worship your image. We'll die before we compromise." This is faith at its purest. This is loyalty at its deepest. This is conviction at its strongest. They were willing to die for their beliefs. They valued their relationship with God more than their lives. They refused to compromise even when compromise would save them. Their answer also contained a subtle rebuke to Nebuchadnezzar. The king had asked, "What God will be able to rescue you from my hand?" Their answer was essentially, "Our God can. And he will. And even if he doesn't, we're still not afraid of you." They turned the king's challenge back on him. They asserted that their God was more powerful than Nebuchadnezzar, that royal authority had limits, that there was a higher power than the throne of Babylon. Nebuchadnezzar's reaction was explosive. The Bible says he was furious with rage. His face became distorted with anger toward Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. Their answer had enraged him beyond reason. How dare they refuse him again? How dare they claim their God was more powerful than he was? How dare they show such defiance? The king gave orders immediately. "Heat the furnace 7 times hotter than usual. Make it as intense as possible. Make their death quick and terrible. Make an example of them that no one would ever forget." The soldiers stoked the furnace. They added more fuel. They worked the bellows. The flames roared higher. The heat intensified. The furnace became incredibly hot. 7 times hotter then. The temperature was extreme even by furnace standards. Then Nebuchadnezzar ordered that Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego be bound. Strong soldiers tied them up. They used ropes or chains. They bound them tightly so they couldn't escape or resist. Notice that the 3 men were still fully clothed. They wore their robes, trousers, turbans, and other clothes. They weren't stripped or prepared for execution in any way. They were thrown in just as they were. The king's command was urgent. Immediate execution. No delay, no ceremony, just throw them in the fire. The strongest soldiers in the army were commanded to carry out the execution. These weren't ordinary guards. These were elite troops. The king wanted to ensure the job was done right. The soldiers grabbed Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. They lifted the bound men. They carried them toward the opening of the furnace. The heat was overwhelming. Even from a distance, the flames were intense. As the soldiers approached the furnace opening, the heat became unbearable. The furnace was so hot, so incredibly superheated, that the flames leaping from the opening killed the soldiers. These strong, elite warriors died instantly from the intense heat. They dropped dead before they could throw the 3 Hebrew men into the fire. But the momentum carried Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego forward. Still bound, still fully clothed, they fell into the blazing furnace. They tumbled into the flames, into the fire that had just killed the soldiers who were merely near it. The witnesses must have watched in horror. The king's other officials. The guards standing at a safer distance. They saw the three men fall into the flames. They saw them disappear into the fire. It should have been over instantly. No one could survive such heat. The furnace had been heated 7 times hotter than normal. It had killed the soldiers just from proximity. What chance did 3 men have actually inside it? Nebuchadnezzar watched from his throne or platform. He expected to see the men consumed immediately. He expected this to be finished quickly. A harsh lesson taught. An example made, but then something impossible happened. King Nebuchadnezzar suddenly leaped to his feet. He was alarmed, startled, shocked by what he was seeing. He turned to his advisors with urgency in his voice. "Weren't there 3 men that we tied up and threw into the fire?" he asked. His advisors confirmed it. "Certainly, O king," they replied. Yes, 3 men had been thrown in. The king's eyes weren't deceiving him about that. "Look," Nebuchadnezzar exclaimed. "I see 4 men walking around in the fire, unbound and unharmed. And the 4th looks like a son of the gods. 4 men, not 3. 4, and they weren't lying down dead. They weren't burning. They were walking around, moving freely, alive, and they were unbound. The ropes or chains that had been tied around them were gone, burned away perhaps. But the men themselves were free. They were walking in the flames. They were unharmed. The fire wasn't consuming them. The flames weren't burning them. They moved through the inferno as if it were a pleasant garden. But most astonishing of all was the 4th figure. Someone else was in the furnace with them. Someone who hadn't been thrown in. Someone who looked divine. Someone whose appearance was unlike ordinary humans. Nebuchadnezzar said this 4th person looked like a son of the gods. As a pagan, this was his way of describing something supernatural, something heavenly, something divine. Who was this mysterious 4th person? The Bible doesn't explicitly identify him in this passage. But Christians throughout history have believed this was a pre-incarnate appearance of Jesus Christ, a theophany, an Old Testament manifestation of the Son of God. God himself had entered the furnace with his faithful servants. They weren't alone in their trial. They weren't abandoned in their suffering. God was with them, right there in the flames, walking beside them, protecting them. This is one of the most beautiful pictures in all of Scripture. When we go through fire, when we face impossible trials, when we suffer for our faith, we are not alone. God is with us. He walks through the flames with us. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego must have been amazed. They had been thrown into the fire. They had expected to die. They had been willing to die. But instead of death, they experienced God's presence in a way they never had before. The fire that was meant to destroy them became the place where they met God. The furnace intended as their grave became holy ground. The flames meant to end their lives revealed God's power and faithfulness. Nebuchadnezzar approached the opening of the blazing furnace, as close as the heat would allow. Close enough to be heard, he called out to the 3 men, "Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, servants of the Most High God, come out. Come here." Notice what he called them. Not servants of Babylon. Not my officials. He called them servants of the Most High God. The king who had demanded they worship his gods now acknowledged their God. The king who had asked what God could save them from his hand now recognized the God who had. He called God the Most High God. This was significant. Nebuchadnezzar was admitting that the God of these 3 Hebrew men was supreme, higher than other gods, higher than Nebuchadnezzar himself. The king commanded them to come out, but he couldn't go in and get them. He could only call to them. They had to choose to come out. They walked through the flames. They moved toward the opening. They emerged from the furnace. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego stepped out of the fire. They stood before the king and all the assembled officials, and everyone crowded around to look at them, to see with their own eyes this impossible miracle. The satraps, prefects, governors, and royal advisors pressed close. They examined the three men carefully. They looked for burns. They checked for injuries. They searched for any sign of damage. And they found nothing. The fire had not harmed their bodies. There wasn't a single burn mark. Their skin was perfect, unscorched, unmarked. Not a hair of their heads was singed. Every hair was intact, perfect, as if they had never been near fire at all. Their robes were not scorched. The clothing they wore should have burned immediately. Fabric catches fire easily, but their robes looked new, undamaged, not even darkened by smoke. There was no smell of fire on them. Usually, even being near a fire causes your clothes and hair to smell of smoke. But these three men didn't smell like fire at all. It was as if the fire had never touched them. The only thing the fire had burned was their bonds. The ropes or chains that tied them were gone. They had been freed from their restraints, but nothing else had been affected. This was a complete miracle, a total vindication, an absolute demonstration of God's power. The fire that killed the soldiers who threw them in had no power over them at all. The furnace that should have consumed them in seconds had left them untouched. Everyone saw it. The king saw it. All the officials saw it. The soldiers saw it. There were hundreds or thousands of witnesses. This wasn't a trick or illusion. This was real, undeniable, impossible to explain away. Nebuchadnezzar was overwhelmed. This proud king, this powerful ruler, this man who had claimed no god could rescue anyone from his hand. He had to admit he was wrong. He spoke out loud, making a public declaration before all the assembled officials. Praise be to the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. The king who demanded worship of his image now praised the God of the Hebrews. The king who had threatened to destroy them now honored their God. The change was dramatic and complete. He continued, explaining what had moved him so deeply. He has sent his angel and rescued his servants. Nebuchadnezzar recognized divine intervention. He acknowledged that God had sent someone to save these three men. He called it an angel. Whether he understood it was actually God himself or a divine messenger, he knew this was supernatural, heavenly, a miracle from above. They trusted in him and defied the king's command. The king admitted their defiance. They had disobeyed his decree. They had refused his command. But now he understood why. They had trusted in their God. Their loyalty to God had been greater than their fear of the king. And Nebuchadnezzar didn't condemn them for this. He praised them. He respected them. He honored their faithfulness. They were willing to give up their lives rather than serve or worship any god except their own God. This was what impressed Nebuchadnezzar most: their absolute commitment, their willingness to die, their refusal to compromise. Even facing certain death, they had remained faithful. This kind of conviction was rare. Most people would have bowed down to save themselves. Most would have rationalized it. But these three men had been willing to die for their beliefs. The king recognized this as something extraordinary, something worthy of respect, something that revealed the power of the God they served. Then Nebuchadnezzar made a decree. He issued a new law to all the peoples, nations, and languages in his empire. Therefore I decree that the people of any nation or language who say anything against the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego be cut into pieces, and their houses be turned into piles of rubble. This was extreme. Nebuchadnezzar went from demanding death for not worshiping his image to demanding death for speaking against the Hebrew God. He swung from one extreme to the other. His reasoning was sound, though, for no other God can save in this way. He had seen with his own eyes what this God could do. No other God had demonstrated such power. No other deity had saved people from his furnace. The God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego had proven himself supreme. This wasn't quite monotheism. Nebuchadnezzar still believed in other gods. But he recognized that the God of Israel was in a category by himself, that he was more powerful than any other deity, that he deserved special honor and protection. The story concludes with a brief but significant statement. Then the king promoted Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego in the province of Babylon. These three men who had faced execution for disobedience were now elevated to even higher positions. They had been administrators before. Now they were promoted, given more responsibility, more authority, more honor. Think about the irony. They had been willing to lose everything. They had chosen faithfulness over position. They had valued God over career. They had been ready to die. But because they chose God first, they gained everything. Because they were willing to lose their positions, they were promoted. Because they were ready to die, they lived and prospered. This is a pattern we see throughout Scripture. God honors those who honor Him. When we put God first, everything else falls into place. When we choose faithfulness, God takes care of the consequences. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego continued to serve in Babylon. But now they served with even greater influence. Now their God had been publicly acknowledged. Now everyone knew the power of the God they worshipped. Their faithfulness had not only saved their lives, it had led to glory for God. It had caused a pagan king to praise the true God. It had resulted in a decree protecting God's honor throughout the empire. It had given them a platform to represent their faith at the highest levels of government. The story of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego in the fiery furnace has inspired believers for thousands of years. What can we learn from their example? First, we learn that some things are worth dying for. These three men believed their loyalty to God was more important than their lives. They weren't willing to compromise their core convictions, even to save themselves. In our world today, we may not face literal fiery furnaces, but we face pressure to compromise, to go along with things that violate our beliefs, to be silent when we should speak, to bow down to the idols of our culture. The story reminds us that faithfulness matters more than comfort, that truth matters more than acceptance, that honoring God matters more than protecting ourselves. Second, we learn that God is with us in our trials. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego weren't spared from the furnace. They were thrown into it, but God was with them in the fire. Sometimes God delivers us from trials. Sometimes He delivers us through trials. These three men experienced the second kind. They went through the fire, but they didn't go through it alone. When we face difficult times, when we suffer for doing right, when we endure persecution for our faith, God is with us. We are not abandoned. We are not alone. Like the fourth man in the furnace, God walks through the flames with us. Third, we learn that our witness matters. The faithfulness of these three men led to the glory of God. Because they stood firm, a pagan king praised the true God. Because they refused to compromise, God's power was demonstrated before the nations. Our faithfulness today still matters. People are watching. When we stand firm in our convictions, when we choose God over convenience, when we honor Him regardless of the cost, it makes an impact. Others notice. God is glorified. We also learn that God is able to do the impossible. Everyone thought these three men would die. The situation seemed hopeless. The outcome seemed certain. But God did what no one expected. We serve a God of miracles, a God who can do what seems impossible, a God who is not limited by circumstances or human power. We should never underestimate what God can do. Fifth, we learn that faithfulness is its own reward. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego didn't know they would be rescued. They said, "Even if He does not save us, we will not bow down." They chose faithfulness without any guarantee of deliverance. This is genuine faith, not faith that bargains with God, not faith that demands outcomes, but faith that trusts God regardless. faith that says, I will obey you whether you rescue me or not. One interesting aspect of this story is the role of peer pressure. When the music played, everyone bowed down. Everyone except 3 men. Imagine the pressure they felt. Thousands of people kneeling around them. Everyone else complying. Only they standing. Only they different. Only they out of step. It would have been so easy to justify bowing down. Everyone else is doing it. It's just a formality. God will understand. We can explain it to him later. One little bow won't hurt. But they resisted that pressure. They didn't let the crowd dictate their actions. They didn't compromise because everyone else was compromising. This speaks to us today. We face tremendous peer pressure. Pressure to conform, to fit in, to not be different, to go along with what everyone else is doing. Social media amplifies this pressure. We see what everyone else is doing. We see the majority opinion. We feel the pull to agree, to like, to share, to participate. But sometimes faithfulness means standing alone. Sometimes doing right means being different. Sometimes honoring God means refusing to go along with the crowd. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego teach us that it's possible to stand against peer pressure. That we can be faithful even when we're in the minority. That truth doesn't change based on how many people agree with it. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego showed faith that could not be shaken. Now we meet a man whose strength could not be matched. But even the strongest man must learn that real power comes from God alone. Let's meet Samson. In ancient Israel, during a time when the Philistines ruled over the Israelite people with an iron fist, there lived a man named Manoah and his wife. They were simple people from the tribe of Dan, living in a small town called Zorah. Their lives were marked by one profound sadness: they had no children. In those days, childlessness was considered not just a personal tragedy, but a sign of misfortune. For years, Manoah's wife had prayed for a child. She had watched other women in her village cradle their babies, had seen children playing in the streets, and had felt the ache of empty arms. But year after year, her prayers seemed to go unanswered. Then one ordinary day, something extraordinary happened. Manoah's wife was alone in a field when a figure appeared before her. At first, she might have thought he was just a traveler, but there was something different about him, something that made the air around him seem to shimmer with otherworldly light. This was no ordinary man. This was an angel of the Lord. "You have been unable to have children," the angel said, his voice gentle but carrying an unmistakable authority. "But you will become pregnant and give birth to a son." The woman's heart must have leaped in her chest. After all these years of waiting, of hoping, of praying, could it really be true? But the angel wasn't finished. "You must be very careful," he continued. "You must not drink wine or any other fermented drink. You must not eat anything unclean. And when your son is born, his hair must never be cut, from the moment of his birth until the day of his death. He will be a Nazirite set apart for God. He will begin the deliverance of Israel from the hands of the Philistines." A Nazirite was someone who took special vows of dedication to God. They couldn't drink alcohol, couldn't touch dead bodies, and couldn't cut their hair. These vows were usually temporary, something a person might do for a few months or a year. But this child would be a Nazirite for his entire life, something almost unheard of. The woman ran home as fast as her legs could carry her. When she found her husband, the words tumbled out of her mouth in a rush of excitement and wonder. "A man of God came to me," she said breathlessly. "He looked like an angel, so awesome and holy that I didn't even ask where he came from. And he told me I'm going to have a son. But there are rules, strict rules we must follow." Manoah listened to his wife's story with a mixture of joy and uncertainty. This was incredible news, but also terrifying. How could they be sure they would raise this special child correctly? What if they made a mistake? That night, Manoah prayed earnestly. "Lord," he said, Please send that man of God back to us to teach us how to raise this boy who will be born to us." God heard Manoah's prayer. The angel appeared again, this time while Manoah's wife was sitting in the field. She ran to get her husband, and together they approached the heavenly visitor. "Are you the man who spoke to my wife?" Manoah asked. "I am," the angel replied. "When your words come true, what kind of rules should govern the boy's life and work?" Manoah wanted to know everything, wanted to be sure they got it right. The angel patiently repeated the instructions: no wine, no unclean food, and the razor must never touch the boy's head. Manoah, overwhelmed with gratitude, offered to prepare a meal for their visitor. But the angel declined to eat, suggesting instead that Manoah present a burnt offering to the Lord. As the flames of the offering rose toward the sky, something miraculous happened. The angel ascended in the fire, rising up toward heaven in the midst of the flames. Manoah and his wife fell to the ground in awe and terror, their faces pressed to the earth. They had been visited by an angel of the Lord himself. "We're going to die," Manoah said, his voice shaking. "We have seen God." But his wife, more practical and perhaps more faithful, reasoned with him. "If the Lord had wanted to kill us, he wouldn't have accepted our offering. He wouldn't have shown us all these wonderful things or told us about our son." She was right. And soon after, just as the angel had promised, Manoah's wife became pregnant. When the baby was born, they named him Samson. From the very beginning, there was something special about this child. As he grew, it became clear that the Lord was with him. He wasn't just strong for his age, he was extraordinarily strong, unnaturally strong. The Spirit of the Lord was stirring within him, even as a young boy. Samson grew up in Zorah and Mahane Dan, living between these two places in the hill country. His hair grew long and thick, never touched by scissors or razor, a visible sign of his vow to God. As he played with other children and learned the ways of his people, he must have realized he was different. When he wrestled with other boys, he had to hold back so he wouldn't hurt them. When he lifted things, he found them far lighter than others did. The Philistines still ruled over Israel in those days. They were a powerful people from across the sea, with superior weapons made of iron and a well-organized military. They had conquered the coastal plains and pushed into the hill country where the Israelites lived. The Israelites paid tribute to them, followed their rules, and lived under their oppression. But Samson was destined to change all that. As Samson entered young adulthood, he traveled to Timnah, a town in Philistine territory. There, something caught his eye, or rather, someone. A young Philistine woman, beautiful and captivating. Samson couldn't take his eyes off her. When he returned home, he went straight to his parents. "I've seen a Philistine woman in Timnah," he announced. "Get her for me as my wife." His parents were horrified. A Philistine? Their son wanted to marry one of their oppressors? Isn't there an acceptable woman among your relatives or among all our people? His father asked. Must you go to the uncircumcised Philistines to get a wife? But Samson was insistent. Get her for me, he repeated. She's the right one for me. What his parents didn't understand was that this was part of God's plan. The Lord was seeking an occasion to confront the Philistines, who were ruling over Israel at that time. Sometimes God works in mysterious ways, using even the desires and impulses of people to accomplish his purposes. So Samson's parents reluctantly agreed, and they traveled with him to Timnah to arrange the marriage. As they walked through the vineyards near the town, something happened that would reveal the true extent of Samson's extraordinary power. A young lion suddenly appeared, roaring and charging straight at Samson. His parents must have screamed, frozen in terror at the sight of this massive predator bearing down on their son. But Samson didn't run. He didn't even reach for a weapon. The Spirit of the Lord came powerfully upon him, and with his bare hands, he grabbed the lion. In moments, he had torn it apart as easily as one might tear a young goat. The lion that would have killed a normal man lay dead at his feet, defeated by Samson's supernatural strength. Strangely, Samson didn't tell his parents what had happened. He simply continued on his way as if nothing had occurred. Perhaps he was beginning to understand that his strength was meant for something greater than impressing others. The marriage negotiations went well. The Philistine woman pleased Samson, and arrangements were made for a wedding feast, as was the custom in those days. Some time later, when Samson returned to Timnah for his wedding, he took the same route through the vineyards. Curiosity drew him to the place where he had killed the lion. What he found there was remarkable. Inside the lion's carcass, a swarm of bees had made a hive, and it was filled with honey. Samson scooped out some of the honey with his hands and ate it as he walked. He even gave some to his parents, though he didn't tell them it came from a dead lion's body. As a Nazirite, touching a dead body should have been forbidden to him, but Samson had already begun to push against the boundaries of his vow. When he arrived in Timnah, the wedding celebration began. In those days, weddings were week-long festivals with feasting, drinking, and celebrating. The Philistines, seeing this strong young Israelite, assigned 30 companions to stay with him during the celebration. Perhaps as much to keep an eye on him as to honor him. As the feast progressed, Samson decided to propose a challenge. "Let me tell you a riddle," he said to the 30 companions. "If you can solve it during the 7 days of the feast, I'll give each of you a linen garment and a set of clothes. But if you can't solve it, you must give me 30 linen garments and 30 sets of clothes." The men agreed, confident in their collective wisdom. "Tell us your riddle," they said. Samson smiled and spoke, "Out of the eater, something to eat; out of the strong, something sweet." The Philistine men looked at each other, puzzled. What could it mean? Out of the eater came something to eat. Out of the strong came something sweet. They turned the riddle over and over in their minds, but couldn't make sense of it. 3 days passed, then 4. The men grew frustrated and angry. On the 7th day, they went to Samson's bride with a threat. "Coax your husband into explaining the riddle for us." They told her, their voices menacing, "Or we will burn you and your father's household to death." "Did you invite us here to steal our property?" The young woman was terrified. These men meant what they said. So she went to Samson weeping. "You hate me," she cried. "You don't really love me. You've given my people a riddle, but you haven't even explained it to me." "I haven't even explained it to my father or mother," Samson replied. "So why should I explain it to you?" But she kept crying and pleading with him for the rest of the 7 days of the feast. She wouldn't leave him alone, following him everywhere, weeping and accusing him of not loving her. Finally, on the 7th day, worn down by her constant nagging, Samson told her the answer. She immediately ran to tell her people. On the final day of the feast, before sunset, the men of the town came to Samson with the answer. "What is sweeter than honey? What is stronger than a lion?" Samson knew immediately what had happened. His bride had betrayed him. Anger flashed in his eyes as he responded, "If you had not plowed with my heifer, you would not have solved my riddle." Then the Spirit of the Lord came powerfully upon him again. He went down to Ashkelon, one of the major Philistine cities on the coast, and struck down 30 of their men. He stripped them of their belongings and gave their clothes to those who had solved the riddle. His anger burning, he then left his bride and returned to his father's house. The wedding was over, but so was the marriage. Samson's bride was given to one of the companions who had attended him at the feast, adding insult to injury. Some time passed, and Samson's anger cooled. During the wheat harvest, he decided to visit his wife, bringing a young goat as a gift. Perhaps he thought they could reconcile, that things could go back to normal. "I'm going to my wife's room," he told her father when he arrived. But her father wouldn't let him in. "I was so sure you hated her," the man explained, "that I gave her to your companion. Isn't her younger sister more attractive? Take her instead." Samson's face must have darkened with rage. First, his wife had betrayed him. Now she had been given to another man. This was an insult he could not bear. "This time I have a right to get even with the Philistines," he declared. "I will really harm them." What Samson did next was both creative and devastating. He went out and caught 300 foxes, or possibly jackals, as some translations suggest. This alone must have been an incredible feat, requiring strength, speed, and cunning. Then he tied them tail to tail in pairs and fastened a torch to every pair of tails. When everything was ready, Samson lit the torches and released the foxes into the standing grain of the Philistines. The terrified animals ran in every direction, unable to escape from each other, the burning torches setting fire to everything they touched. The wheat fields burst into flames. The grain that was still standing, the grain that had already been cut and bundled into shocks, even the vineyards and olive groves. All of it was consumed by fire. The economic impact was catastrophic. A whole season's harvest gone in one night. The Philistines were enraged. Who did this? They demanded. When they learned it was Samson and why he had done it, because his wife had been given to his companion, they turned their fury on her and her father. In a terrible act of vengeance, they burned them to death. But Samson wasn't finished. When he learned what they had done to his former wife, he attacked the Philistines viciously, striking them down with great slaughter. After this, he went to live in a cave in the rock of Etam, perhaps knowing the Philistines would come looking for him. The Philistines did come looking for him. They came in force, an army moving through the land, camping in Judah and spreading out near a place called Lehi. The men of Judah, seeing this massive military presence, were terrified. "Why have you come to fight us?" they asked the Philistine commanders. "We've come to take Samson prisoner," they replied. "We're going to do to him what he did to us." 3,000 men from Judah then went down to the cave where Samson was hiding. Think about that for a moment. It took 3,000 Israelites to confront one man. They were afraid of their own kinsmen. "Don't you realize that the Philistines are rulers over us?" they said to Samson. "What have you done to us?" "I merely did to them what they did to me," Samson replied simply. The men of Judah were more afraid of the Philistines than loyal to their own people. "We've come to tie you up and hand you over to the Philistines," they told him. Here was Samson, fighting for the freedom of his people, and his own people were betraying him. It must have been a bitter moment. But Samson, perhaps understanding their fear, agreed on one condition: "Swear to me that you won't kill me yourselves." "We will only tie you up and hand you over to them," they promised. "We will not kill you." So they bound him with 2 new ropes and led him up from the cave. 3,000 men escorted one bound prisoner, a testament to how dangerous they considered him. When they reached Lehi, the Philistines came towards Samson, shouting in triumph. They thought they had finally captured the man who had caused them so much trouble. They were wrong. The Spirit of the Lord came powerfully upon Samson once again. The ropes on his arms became like charred flax, and the bindings dropped from his hands as if they were nothing. Looking around for a weapon, Samson spotted the fresh jawbone of a donkey. He reached down, picked it up, and then he attacked. What happened next is almost beyond belief. With nothing but a donkey's jawbone, Samson struck down 1,000 Philistine men. 1 man against 1,000, armed with only a piece of bone, and he won. The battlefield must have been carnage, bodies everywhere, the Philistine army routed by a single warrior. When it was over, Samson composed a victory song on the spot. "With a donkey's jawbone I have made donkeys of them. With a donkey's jawbone I have killed 1,000 men." Then he threw down the jawbone, and the place was named Ramath-Lehi Bone Hill. But the battle had taken its toll. Samson was desperately thirsty, so thirsty he thought he might die after surviving such an incredible fight. He cried out to the Lord, "You have given your servant this great victory. Must I now die of thirst and fall into the hands of the uncircumcised?" God heard his prayer. The ground split open at Lehi, and water came gushing out. Samson drank, his strength returned, and he revived. The spring was called In Hakkore, spring of the one who called out, and it remained there for years afterward. Samson led Israel for 20 years during the period of Philistine oppression. He was a judge, settling disputes and leading his people, all while serving as a one-man resistance against the Philistine occupation. One day Samson went to Gaza, one of the 5 great Philistine cities on the coast. While there, he saw a prostitute and went in to spend the night with her. This was another instance of Samson's weakness when it came to women, and another violation of the purity expected of a Nazirite. The people of Gaza heard that Samson was there. "Samson is here." The word spread through the city. Here was their chance to capture or kill the man who had caused the Philistines so much trouble. They surrounded the place and lay in wait for him all night at the city gate. They kept quiet during the night, thinking, "At dawn we'll kill him." But Samson didn't wait for dawn. At midnight he got up and took hold of the doors of the city gate, along with the 2 posts. He pulled them loose, bar and all, and lifted them to his shoulders. Then he carried them to the top of the hill that faces Hebron, a distance of about 40 miles. Imagine the scene at dawn, the Philistines waiting at the gate to ambush Samson, only to discover that the gates themselves were gone. Imagine the people of Gaza waking up to find their city defenseless. The massive gates, which would have weighed thousands of pounds, simply vanished, carried away in the night by one man. It was humiliating for the Philistines, and it added to the growing legend of Samson's strength. After this, Samson fell in love with a woman who would become the most famous or infamous woman in his story. Her name was Delilah, and she lived in the valley of Sorek, which ran between Philistine and Israelite territory. The rulers of the Philistines, the 5 lords who governed the 5 major Philistine cities, went to Delilah with a proposition. They had tried to capture Samson through military force and failed. They had tried to ambush him and failed. Now they would try a different approach. "See if you can lure him into showing you the secret of his great strength," they told Delilah, "and how we can overpower him so we may tie him up and subdue him. Each one of us will give you 1,100 shekels of silver." The amount they offered was staggering 5,500 shekels of silver in total. It was a fortune, enough to make Delilah wealthy beyond her dreams, and all she had to do was betray the man who loved her. She agreed. Delilah began her campaign of seduction and deception with calculated precision. "Tell me the secret of your great strength," she asked Samson, "and how you can be tied up and subdued." Samson, perhaps thinking he was being clever, lied to her. "If anyone ties me with 7 fresh bowstrings that have not been dried," he said, "I'll become as weak as any other man." The Philistine rulers brought Delilah 7 fresh bowstrings, and she tied Samson with them. She had men hidden in the room, waiting to capture him. Then she called out, "Samson, the Philistines are upon you." But Samson snapped the bowstrings as easily as a piece of string snaps when it comes close to a flame. The secret of his strength remained unknown. "You have made a fool of me," Delilah said to him. "You lied to me. Come now, tell me how you can be tied." Samson gave her another false answer. "If anyone ties me securely with new ropes that have never been used, I'll become as weak as any other man." So Delilah took new ropes and tied him with them. Again, with men hidden in the room, she called out, "Samson, the Philistines are upon you." And again, Samson broke free, snapping the ropes off his arms as if they were threads. "You have made a fool of me again," Delilah complained. "You have been lying to me. Tell me how you can be tied." This time Samson said, "If you weave the 7 braids of my head into the fabric on a loom and tighten it with the pin, I'll become as weak as any other man." While he slept, Delilah wove his hair into the loom. Once again she called out, "Samson, the Philistines are upon you." And once again Samson woke up and pulled free, yanking the pin and the loom away. This pattern continued, with Delilah growing more and more frustrated. But she didn't give up. Instead, she began to use emotional manipulation, a tactic that would prove devastatingly effective. "How can you say, 'I love you,' when you won't confide in me?" She nagged him. "This is the 3rd time you have made a fool of me and haven't told me the secret of your great strength." Day after day she prodded him with her words. She gave him no peace, following him around, constantly asking, constantly pressing, constantly accusing him of not really loving her. The nagging was relentless, exhausting, wearing him down bit by bit. Finally, Samson could take it no more. He was tired of the lies, tired of the games, tired of her endless questioning, so he told her everything. "No razor has ever been used on my head," he said, "because I have been a Nazirite dedicated to God from my mother's womb. If my head were shaved, my strength would leave me, and I would become as weak as any other man." Delilah realized that this time he had told her the truth. She could hear it in his voice, see it in his eyes. She sent word to the Philistine rulers, "Come back once more, he has told me everything." They came, bringing the silver they had promised her. That night, Delilah made Samson comfortable and lulled him to sleep with his head in her lap. As he slept perhaps the deepest, most vulnerable sleep of his life, she called in a man to shave off the 7 braids of his hair. As the razor moved across his head, as each braid fell away, something profound was happening. The source of Samson's strength wasn't really his hair, it was his dedication to God, symbolized by his uncut hair. By allowing his hair to be cut, Samson had broken his Nazirite vow. He had turned away from the commitment that had been made before he was even born. When all his hair was gone, Delilah began to subdue him. Then she called out, as she had done so many times before, "Samson, the Philistines are upon you." Samson woke up and thought, "I'll go out as before and shake myself free." He didn't know that the Lord had left him. The Philistines seized him immediately. This time, there was no supernatural strength to save him. He was just a man who had been betrayed by the woman he loved, a man who had broken his sacred vow. What the Philistines did next was brutal and calculated to break him completely. They gouged out his eyes, plunging Samson into permanent darkness. The man who had once looked with desire upon Philistine women, who had seen his enemies and struck them down. Now he would see nothing ever again. They brought him down to Gaza, the very city whose gates he had once carried away. There they bound him with bronze shackles. They put him to work at the grinding mill in the prison, doing the work usually reserved for animals or slaves. The mighty warrior who had once led Israel, who had killed 1,000 men with a jawbone, who had torn apart a lion with his bare hands. Now he walked in circles in the darkness, pushing a heavy millstone, grinding grain for his captors. It was a complete humiliation. The Philistines had finally defeated Samson, not through strength, but through deception. They had used his weakness for women against him, and they had won. But as Samson worked in that prison, grinding grain day after day in the darkness, something was happening that the Philistines didn't notice. His hair was beginning to grow back. And perhaps, in the darkness and the suffering, Samson was beginning to remember who he really was. Perhaps he was repenting of his foolishness, his pride, his betrayals of his vow. Perhaps, for the first time in years, he was truly turning back to God. The Philistine rulers decided to hold a great celebration. They gathered to offer a magnificent sacrifice to their god Dagon, whom they credited with delivering Samson into their hands. "Our God has delivered Samson, our enemy, into our hands," they sang. "The one who laid waste our land and multiplied our slain." The temple of Dagon was packed with people. The 5 Philistine rulers were there, and about 3,000 men and women were on the roof, watching the festivities below. They were eating, drinking, celebrating their victory. As the celebration reached its peak, someone had an idea. "Bring out Samson to entertain us," they called. So they brought Samson from the prison. The blind former champion was led out to stand between the pillars of the temple. The crowd roared with laughter and mockery when they saw him. Here was the man who had once terrified them, now blind and helpless, brought out like a performing animal for their amusement. They made him perform for them, mocking him, probably forcing him to demonstrate his lost strength, laughing at how weak he had become. For Samson, it must have been the ultimate humiliation. A young servant boy was assigned to lead Samson by the hand. After some time, Samson said to him, "Put me where I can feel the pillars that support the temple, so that I may lean against them." The boy led him to the central pillars of the temple. Samson placed his hands on them, one on each of the two middle pillars that held up the entire structure. The noise of the celebration filled the air around him. Samson couldn't see the crowds, but he could hear them: the laughter, the mockery, the sounds of thousands of his enemies celebrating his downfall and their God's supposed victory. Then Samson prayed. It was a simple prayer, direct and heartfelt. Sovereign Lord, remember me. Please, God, strengthen me just once more, and let me with one blow get revenge on the Philistines for my 2 eyes. After everything, all his mistakes, all his broken vows, all his sins, Samson was turning back to God one final time, and God heard him. Samson braced himself against the pillars. He put his right hand on one and his left hand on the other. Then he called out in a loud voice, "Let me die with the Philistines." He pushed with all his might. The pillars began to crack. The temple began to shake. For a moment, everything seemed to hang in the balance. Then the pillars gave way. The massive structure came crashing down. The roof, with its 3,000 spectators, collapsed. The walls fell inward. The temple of Dagon and everyone in it was buried in rubble. In his death, Samson killed more Philistines than he had killed during his entire life. The 5 Philistine rulers died that day. Thousands of their people died. It was a devastating blow to the Philistine power structure. When news of the disaster reached Samson's family, his brothers and his father's whole family came to Gaza. They dug through the rubble and recovered his body. They carried him back home and buried him between Zorah and Eshtaol, in the tomb of his father Manoah, the same region where he had grown up, where the angel had first appeared to his mother so many years before. Samson's story is one of the most complex and tragic in all of Scripture. He was a man blessed with extraordinary gifts, supernatural strength, the Spirit of God, a divine calling to begin delivering Israel from their oppressors. Yet he was also deeply flawed, constantly giving in to his desires, repeatedly breaking his vows, trusting the wrong people. He judged Israel for 20 years, but he never led an army, never organized a rebellion, never built a lasting movement. He was essentially a one-man guerrilla force, striking at the Philistines through individual acts of incredible violence. His weakness for women led to his downfall, yet it was also part of how God used him to confront the Philistines. His relationship with the Philistine woman in Timnah created the initial conflict. His visit to the prostitute in Gaza demonstrated his power when he carried away the gates. And his love for Delilah led to his capture, humiliation, and ultimately his greatest victory. Samson broke virtually every aspect of his Nazirite vow. He touched dead bodies, the lion, the donkey's jawbone, probably the Philistines he killed. He attended a week-long wedding feast where wine was certainly flowing. And finally, he allowed his hair to be cut. Yet even after all of this, when he called out to God one final time, God answered him. The story of Samson teaches us many things. It shows us that God can use flawed people to accomplish his purposes. It demonstrates the consequences of giving in to our weaknesses and breaking our commitments. It reveals how even when we fail, even when we fall, God's mercy is available if we truly turn back to him. Samson was buried in his father's tomb, and his 20-year leadership of Israel came to an end. He had indeed begun the deliverance of Israel from the Philistines, just as the angel had promised before his birth. The Philistines' power was significantly weakened by his actions, especially his final act of destruction. Years later, Samson would be remembered as one of the great heroes of faith, his name included among the faithful in the book of Hebrews. Not because he was perfect, far from it, but because ultimately, despite all his failures, he was used by God to strike a blow for Israel's freedom. The story of Samson reminds us that strength isn't just about physical power. Real strength comes from staying true to our commitments, from resisting temptation, from trusting God, even when we don't understand his plans. Samson had the greatest physical strength of any man in his time, but his real weakness was his inability to control himself, to resist his desires, to maintain his dedication to God. In the end, though, Samson got one more chance. In his darkest moment, blind and humiliated, grinding grain in a Philistine prison, his hair growing back and his faith perhaps renewed, he was given the opportunity to fulfill his calling one last time. And when that moment came, he seized it with both hands literally and brought the whole structure crashing down. Now, let's meet Moses, a man who led an entire nation to freedom. His journey began in the most unexpected way, as a baby hidden from danger. Our story begins in Egypt, around 3,300 years ago, in a time of tremendous suffering. The Hebrew people, descendants of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, had lived in Egypt for generations. They had come during a famine, invited by Joseph, one of their own who had risen to become a powerful official in Egypt. But those good days were long gone. A new pharaoh now ruled Egypt, and he looked at the Hebrew people with suspicion and fear. They had grown numerous, too numerous, he thought. What if they became so many that they could rise up against Egypt? What if, during a war, they sided with Egypt's enemies? So Pharaoh made a cruel decision. He turned the Hebrews into slaves. They were forced to make bricks and build cities, working under the hot sun with Egyptian taskmasters cracking whips over their backs. The Pharaoh hoped this would break them, reduce their numbers. It didn't work. The Hebrews kept growing in number. This made Pharaoh even more afraid, so he made an even more terrible decree. Every Hebrew baby boy must be thrown into the Nile River to drown. Baby girls could live, but every son must die. Into this nightmare, a baby was born. His mother, Jochebed, looked at her newborn son and couldn't bear to let him die. For 3 months, she hid him in her home, keeping him quiet, keeping him secret. But as he grew, he cried louder. Soon she knew the Egyptian soldiers would hear him. Jochebed made a desperate plan. She took a basket made of papyrus reeds and waterproofed it with tar and pitch. She placed her baby inside, then carried the basket to the Nile River, the very place where Pharaoh had commanded Hebrew babies to be thrown. But she didn't throw the basket in to sink. Instead, she placed it gently among the reeds at the river's edge, where it would float. She told her daughter Miriam, the baby's older sister, to hide nearby and watch what happened. The basket floated there, rocking gently in the water with the baby inside. And then, by what seemed like chance, or perhaps by design, Pharaoh's own daughter came down to the river to bathe. The princess noticed the basket among the reeds. Curious, she sent one of her attendants to fetch it. When she opened it, she found a crying baby boy inside. The princess was moved with compassion. She knew immediately this must be one of the Hebrew babies, who else would abandon a child in a basket on the river. At that moment, Miriam emerged from her hiding place. The young girl was brave and quick-thinking. She approached the princess with a suggestion. "Would you like me to find a Hebrew woman to nurse the baby for you?" The princess agreed. Miriam ran and brought back her own mother, the baby's real mother. The princess hired Jochebed to nurse her own son, paying her to care for him. It was an extraordinary turn of events. The baby, condemned to die, was now under the protection of the most powerful family in Egypt. The princess adopted the boy as her own son. She named him Moses, which sounds like the Hebrew word for drawn out, because she had drawn him out of the water. Moses would grow up in Pharaoh's palace, raised as Egyptian royalty, given the best education, the finest food, the most privileged life imaginable, while his own people suffered as slaves just outside the palace walls. Moses grew into adulthood surrounded by Egyptian luxury and power. He was raised as a prince, but he knew his true identity. He knew he was Hebrew by birth, even if Egyptian by upbringing. And this created a conflict deep within him. One day, when Moses was 40 years old, he decided to go out and see his own people, to witness their suffering firsthand. What he saw disturbed him deeply. Hebrew slaves laboring under the brutal supervision of Egyptian taskmasters, beaten and abused. As Moses watched, he saw an Egyptian beating a Hebrew slave viciously. Something snapped inside Moses. He looked around to make sure no one was watching. Then he attacked the Egyptian and killed him. Panicking, Moses buried the body in the sand, hoping no one would discover what he had done. The next day, Moses went out again. This time he saw two Hebrew men fighting each other. Moses tried to intervene, saying to the one in the wrong, "Why are you hitting your fellow Hebrew?" The man turned on Moses with contempt. "Who made you a ruler and judge over us?" He sneered. "Are you going to kill me like you killed that Egyptian?" Moses' heart sank. His secret was out. If the Hebrews knew, Pharaoh would soon know. And indeed, when Pharaoh heard about the murder, he ordered Moses arrested and executed. Moses had no choice. He fled Egypt, leaving behind his life of privilege, becoming a fugitive and a wanderer. He ran east, across the desert wilderness of the Sinai Peninsula, until he was far from Egypt's reach. Moses eventually arrived in the land of Midian, exhausted from his journey. He sat down by a well to rest, and once again, his life was about to change at a waterside. 7 sisters came to the well to draw water for their father's flocks, but some shepherds arrived and tried to drive the women away. Moses stood up and defended them, then helped them water their animals. When the sisters returned home earlier than usual, their father Jethro, also called Reuel, asked why. They explained that an Egyptian had helped them. Moses, still dressed in Egyptian clothing, speaking with an Egyptian accent, looked Egyptian to them. Jethro was impressed. He invited Moses to stay with his family and eventually gave Moses his daughter Zipporah in marriage. Moses, the former prince of Egypt, became a shepherd in Midian. He settled into a quiet, humble life, tending flocks in the wilderness. He and Zipporah had a son, whom Moses named Gershom, meaning a foreigner there, because Moses said, "I have become a foreigner in a foreign land." 40 years passed. Moses was now 80 years old. The Pharaoh who had tried to kill him died, but a new Pharaoh took his place, and the suffering of the Hebrews in Egypt continued. They cried out in their slavery, and their cries rose up to God. Moses knew nothing of this. He was simply a shepherd now, living a quiet life far from the drama of Egypt. He had probably given up any thought of his people or his past. But God had not forgotten. One day Moses was leading his father-in-law's flock deep into the wilderness, near a mountain called Horeb, also known as Mount Sinai. As he walked, something caught his eye. A bush was on fire. This wasn't unusual in the desert. Dry bushes could catch fire from the heat. But as Moses watched, he realized something was very unusual indeed. The bush kept burning, but it wasn't being consumed. The flames danced around it, but the branches and leaves remained intact. Curious, Moses turned aside to get a closer look. As he approached, a voice called out from the bush, "Moses, Moses." "Here I am," Moses replied. "Don't come any closer," the voice said. "Take off your sandals, because you're standing on holy ground." Moses' heart must have been pounding. The voice continued, "I am the God of your father, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob." Moses hid his face, afraid to look at God. God spoke again, and what he said would change everything. "I have seen the misery of my people in Egypt. I have heard them crying out because of their slave drivers. I am concerned about their suffering. So I have come down to rescue them from the Egyptians and to bring them up out of that land into a good and spacious land, a land flowing with milk and honey." Then came the part that must have shocked Moses. "So now, go. I am sending you to Pharaoh to bring my people out of Egypt." Moses was stunned. Him? Go back to Egypt? Face Pharaoh? He immediately began making excuses. "Who am I to do this?" Moses protested. "I'm nobody. Why would Pharaoh listen to me?" God promised, "I will be with you." But Moses wasn't convinced. "When I go to the Israelites and tell them the God of their fathers sent me, they'll ask me your name. What should I tell them?" God answered with mysterious words, "I am who I am. Tell them I am has sent you." He also told Moses to use the name Yahweh, often written as Lord, the personal name of God that would become sacred to the Hebrews. Still Moses hesitated. What if they don't believe me? God gave Moses miraculous signs he could perform. His staff could turn into a snake, his hand could become leprous and then heal, and he could turn water into blood. These signs would prove he was speaking for God. But Moses had one more excuse. Lord, I'm not a good speaker. I'm slow of speech and tongue. God's patience was wearing thin. Who made the human mouth? Is it not I? Now go. I will help you speak and teach you what to say. Moses made one final desperate plea. Please, Lord, send someone else. Now God was angry, but he offered a compromise. Moses' brother Aaron, who was a good speaker, could be Moses' spokesman. God would tell Moses what to say, Moses would tell Aaron, and Aaron would speak to the people. Moses had run out of excuses. He said goodbye to his father-in-law, gathered his wife and sons, and set out on the long journey back to Egypt, back to the place he had fled 40 years earlier, back to face the most powerful ruler on earth. On the journey to Egypt, something strange and frightening happened. God met Moses at a lodging place and was about to kill him. The text suggests this was because Moses had not circumcised his son, which was the sign of God's covenant with Abraham's descendants. Zipporah quickly took a flint knife and circumcised their son, and God let Moses alone. It was a harsh reminder. If Moses was going to represent God and lead God's people, he needed to obey God's commands, even the ones that seemed difficult or painful. Meanwhile, God had spoken to Aaron in Egypt, telling him to go into the wilderness to meet his brother. When the brothers met, Moses told Aaron everything God had said. They traveled to Egypt together and gathered all the Hebrew elders. Aaron spoke the words God had given them, and Moses performed the miraculous signs. When the people saw that God had noticed their suffering and was going to rescue them, they bowed down and worshipped. But the Pharaoh would not be so easily convinced. Moses and Aaron went to Pharaoh's palace and delivered God's message, "Let my people go, so they may hold a festival to me in the wilderness." Pharaoh's response dripped with contempt. "Who is the Lord that I should obey him? I don't know the Lord, and I will not let Israel go." Not only did Pharaoh refuse, but he made the Hebrews' lives even harder. Previously, the Egyptians had supplied straw for the Hebrew slaves to use in making bricks. Now Pharaoh ordered that the Hebrews must gather their own straw while still producing the same number of bricks. It was impossible, and the Hebrew foremen were beaten when they couldn't meet the quota. The Hebrew foremen were furious. They confronted Moses and Aaron. "May the Lord judge you. You've made Pharaoh hate us. You've given him an excuse to kill us." Moses was discouraged. He cried out to God, "Why have you brought trouble on these people? Ever since I went to Pharaoh, he has made things worse, and you haven't rescued your people at all." God reassured Moses. The rescue was coming, but first, Pharaoh would have to learn who the Lord really was. And that lesson would come through a series of devastating plagues. The plagues started almost gently, as if to give Pharaoh opportunities to change his mind before things got truly terrible. First is the plague of blood. Moses met Pharaoh at the Nile River in the morning. He struck the water with his staff, and the entire Nile turned to blood. Fish died, the river stank, and the Egyptians couldn't drink the water. But Pharaoh's magicians were able to replicate the miracle using their secret arts, so Pharaoh wasn't impressed. He went back to his palace and hardened his heart. 7 days passed, and the plague of frogs came. God sent frogs. Millions upon millions of frogs. They came up from the Nile and swarmed everywhere, in houses, bedrooms, beds, ovens, and kneading bowls. The frogs were everywhere you looked, everywhere you stepped. Pharaoh's magicians could also produce frogs, but they couldn't make them go away. Pharaoh called for Moses and Aaron and begged them to pray that God would take away the frogs. He promised, "I will let the people go to sacrifice to the Lord." Moses prayed, and God made all the frogs die. The Egyptians gathered them into heaps, and the land reeked of dead frogs. But as soon as the plague was over, Pharaoh changed his mind and refused to let the people go. Aaron struck the dust of the ground with his staff, and all the dust throughout Egypt turned into gnats, tiny, biting insects that swarmed on people and animals. Pharaoh's magicians tried to produce gnats, but couldn't. They told Pharaoh, "This is the finger of God." But Pharaoh's heart remained hard. This necessitated the plague of flies. Dense swarms of flies filled Egyptian houses and covered the ground. But this time, God made a distinction. The land of Goshen, where the Hebrews lived, had no flies. This was a sign that God was protecting his people while judging Egypt. Again, Pharaoh promised to let the people go if Moses would pray to remove the flies. Again, God removed the plague. And again, Pharaoh broke his promise. The pattern was becoming clear. Pharaoh would promise anything to end his suffering, but the moment the pressure was off, he went back on his word. The plague on livestock. God struck all the Egyptian livestock, horses, donkeys, camels, cattle, sheep, and goats, with a terrible disease. They all died, but not a single animal belonging to the Israelites died. Pharaoh even sent investigators to confirm this, but when they reported back that it was true, Pharaoh still refused to let the people go. The plague of boils visited them. Moses took handfuls of soot from a furnace and tossed it into the air while Pharaoh watched. The soot spread throughout Egypt and produced festering boils on people and animals. The Egyptian magicians couldn't even stand before Moses because they too were covered in painful boils. Still, Pharaoh refused. God sent advance warning through Moses, "Tomorrow at this time I will send the worst hailstorm that has ever fallen on Egypt." Some Egyptians feared God's word and brought their slaves and livestock inside. Others ignored the warning. The hailstorm was catastrophic: thunder, hail, and lightning striking the ground. The hail struck down everything in the fields: people, animals, plants. Trees were shattered. It was the worst storm Egypt had ever experienced. But in Goshen, where the Israelites lived, there was no hail. Pharaoh summoned Moses and Aaron. "I have sinned," he admitted. "The Lord is righteous, and I and my people are in the wrong. Pray to the Lord, for we've had enough thunder and hail. I will let you go." Moses prayed, and the hail stopped. But you can guess what happened next. Pharaoh hardened his heart and refused to let the people go. Moses warned that God would send locusts to cover the face of the ground so thickly you couldn't see it. They would devour everything the hail had left. Even Pharaoh's officials begged him to let the Israelites go. "How long will this man be a snare to us? Don't you realize Egypt is ruined?" Pharaoh called Moses and Aaron back. He tried to negotiate, "Go, worship the Lord your God." "But who exactly will be going?" "We'll go with our young and old, our sons and daughters," Moses replied. "We'll go with our flocks and herds because we're going to celebrate a festival to the Lord." Pharaoh was suspicious. He thought if the women and children stayed behind, the men would have to return. "Have only the men go," he commanded, and he had Moses and Aaron thrown out of his presence. So God sent the locusts. An east wind blew all that day and night, and by morning it had brought swarms of locusts that covered everything. They devoured every plant, every fruit on the trees, everything green in all of Egypt. Nothing green remained. Pharaoh quickly summoned Moses and Aaron. "I have sinned against the Lord your God and against you," he said. "Forgive my sin and pray that the Lord will take this deadly plague away." Moses prayed, and God changed the wind to blow from the west, driving all the locusts into the Red Sea. Not a single locust remained in Egypt. And then, yes, Pharaoh hardened his heart again. And then came darkness and death, the plague of darkness. Moses stretched out his hand toward the sky, and total darkness covered Egypt for 3 days. It wasn't just nighttime. It was a thick, oppressive darkness that could be felt. People couldn't see each other or move about, but the Israelites had light in their homes. Pharaoh called Moses. "Go, worship the Lord. Even your women and children may go. Just leave your flocks and herds behind." But Moses refused. "We need our livestock to sacrifice to the Lord our God. Every one of our animals must go with us." Pharaoh exploded in rage. "Get out of my sight. Make sure you don't appear before me again. The day you see my face, you will die. Just as you say, Moses replied. "I will never appear before you again." But there was one plague left, the worst one of all. God gave Moses a terrible message. At midnight, he would pass through Egypt, and every firstborn son would die. From the firstborn of Pharaoh, who sat on the throne, to the firstborn of the slave girl at her grinding stone, and even the firstborn of all the livestock. There would be loud wailing throughout Egypt, worse than there had ever been or ever would be again. But God's own people would be protected. God gave Moses detailed instructions for what the Israelites must do. Each family was to select a lamb, a year-old male without defect. On the 14th day of the month, at twilight, they were to slaughter the lamb. They were to take some of the blood and put it on the sides and tops of the door frames of their houses. That night, they were to roast the lamb and eat it with bitter herbs and bread made without yeast. They were to eat it quickly, dressed and ready to travel, with their sandals on and their staffs in their hands. God said, "On that same night I will pass through Egypt and strike down every firstborn. The blood will be a sign for you on the houses where you are. When I see the blood, I will pass over you." This night would become so significant that God commanded the Israelites to commemorate it every year forever. It would mark the beginning of their calendar, their new year. They would call it Passover because God passed over the houses marked with blood. The Israelites did exactly as God commanded. They took lambs, killed them, painted their doorframes with blood, and stayed inside their homes waiting. At midnight it happened. God struck down all the firstborn in Egypt, every single one. Pharaoh's firstborn son died. The firstborn of prisoners in dungeons died. The firstborn of livestock died. There was not a house in Egypt without someone dead. The wailing began. Pharaoh got up during the night, along with all his officials and all the Egyptians. The screaming and crying filled the darkness. Every family was in mourning. Pharaoh summoned Moses and Aaron during the night. His resistance was completely broken. "Up," he said, "leave my people, you and the Israelites. Go worship the Lord as you have requested. Take your flocks and herds and go, and also bless me." The Egyptians urged the people to hurry and leave the country. For otherwise, they said, "We will all die." The Israelites had been preparing. They took their dough before the yeast was added and carried it on their shoulders in kneading troughs wrapped in clothing. They also asked the Egyptians for articles of silver and gold and for clothing. God had made the Egyptians favorably disposed toward the people, and they gave them what they asked for. In this way, the Israelites plundered Egypt. The wealth of their former slave masters was now theirs. The Israelites set out from Ramesses and traveled to Sukkoth. There were about 600,000 men on foot, besides women and children. Many other people went up with them, and also large droves of livestock. With all the women, children, elderly, and others, the total number was probably more than 2 million people. They had lived in Egypt for 430 years. Now, after one night of divine judgment, they were free. The Israelites traveled from Egypt, and God went ahead of them. During the day, he appeared as a pillar of cloud to guide them. At night, he became a pillar of fire to give them light. This way they could travel by day or night. The pillar never left its place in front of the people. God didn't lead them along the coastal road toward Philistine country, even though that was shorter. God said, if they face war, they might change their minds and return to Egypt. Instead, he led them toward the Red Sea, taking them on a longer route through the wilderness. Moses took the bones of Joseph with him, as Joseph had made the Israelites swear to do. Joseph had said, "God will surely come to your aid, and then you must carry my bones up with you from this place." After the Israelites left, Pharaoh began to regret his decision. "What have we done? We have let the Israelites go and have lost their services." He prepared his chariot and took his army with him, minus 600 of the best chariots, along with all the other chariots of Egypt, with officers over all of them. Pharaoh's heart had hardened one final time, and he pursued the Israelites. The Israelites were camped by the Red Sea when someone spotted dust clouds in the distance. The Egyptian army was coming. Pharaoh with all his horses, chariots, horsemen, and troops. The people were terrified. They cried out to God, then turned on Moses in anger. Was it because there were no graves in Egypt that you brought us to the desert to die? What have you done to us by bringing us out of Egypt? Didn't we tell you in Egypt, leave us alone? Let us serve the Egyptians. It would have been better for us to serve the Egyptians than to die in the desert. They were trapped. Behind them, the most powerful army in the world was bearing down on them. In front of them was the sea. There was no escape. Moses answered the people, "Don't be afraid. Stand firm and you will see the deliverance the Lord will bring you today. The Egyptians you see today you will never see again. The Lord will fight for you. You need only to be still." Then God spoke to Moses, "Why are you crying out to me? Tell the Israelites to move forward. Raise your staff and stretch out your hand over the sea to divide the water so the Israelites can go through the sea on dry ground." The pillar of cloud moved from in front of them and stood behind them, coming between the Egyptian army and the Israelites. It brought darkness to the Egyptians, but gave light to the Israelites, so neither side could approach the other all night. Moses stretched out his hand over the sea, and all that night God drove the sea back with a strong east wind and turned it into dry land. The waters divided. The Israelites went through the sea on dry ground, with walls of water on their right and on their left. Can you imagine that moment? Walking between walls of water, seeing fish swimming past, feeling the spray, but walking on dry ground where the bottom of the sea should be. 2 million people crossing through a path God had carved through the waters. The Egyptians saw the Israelites entering the sea and pursued them. All of Pharaoh's horses, chariots, and horsemen followed them into the sea. But during the last watch of the night, God looked down at the Egyptian army from the pillar of fire and cloud and threw them into confusion. He jammed the wheels of their chariots so they had difficulty driving. The Egyptians began to panic. "Let's get away from the Israelites," they shouted. "The Lord is fighting for them against Egypt." But it was too late. The Israelites reached the other side safely. Then God said to Moses, "Stretch out your hand over the sea, so the water may flow back over the Egyptians and their chariots and horsemen." Moses stretched out his hand over the sea, and at daybreak the sea returned to its place. The Egyptians were fleeing toward it, and God swept them into the sea. The water flowed back and covered the chariots and horsemen, the entire army of Pharaoh that had followed the Israelites into the sea. Not one of them survived. The Israelites stood on the shore and saw the Egyptians lying dead on the beach. They saw what God had done, the great power the Lord displayed against the Egyptians. The people feared the Lord and put their trust in him and in Moses his servant. Moses and the Israelites sang a song of triumph to God, celebrating their deliverance. Miriam, Moses' sister, who had watched over him as a baby in the basket, took a tambourine and led all the women in dancing and singing, "Sing of the Lord, for he is highly exalted. Both horse and driver he has hurled into the sea." They were free, truly free. The most powerful empire on earth could not hold them. But their journey was just beginning. The joy of deliverance didn't last long. 3 days into the desert, the people ran out of water. When they came to Marah, they found water, but it was too bitter to drink. The people grumbled against Moses, "What are we going to drink?" Moses cried out to God, and God showed him a piece of wood. Moses threw it into the water, and the water became sweet. They moved on to a limb where there were 12 springs and 70 palm trees, and they camped there near the water. But soon they faced another problem: food. They had left Egypt a month and a half earlier, and their supplies were running out. The whole community grumbled against Moses and Aaron. "If only we had died by the Lord's hand in Egypt. There we sat around pots of meat and ate all the food we wanted, but you have brought us out into this desert to starve this entire assembly to death." It's stunning how quickly they forgot their slavery and remembered only the food. But God was patient with them. He told Moses, "I will rain down bread from heaven for you." The next morning, when the dew lifted, there were thin flakes like frost on the desert floor. The Israelites looked at it and asked each other, "What is it?" In Hebrew, manhu, which sounds like manna. Moses told them, "It is the bread the Lord has given you to eat." Each morning, the people went out and gathered enough manna for that day. It tasted like wafers made with honey. On the 6th day, they gathered twice as much, so they wouldn't have to work on the Sabbath. God also sent quail in the evening, so the people had meat. The manna continued to fall every morning for the next 40 years, every single day until they entered the Promised Land. The Israelites continued traveling through the desert, and again they had no water. At a place called Rephidim, they quarreled with Moses, "Give us water to drink." Moses replied, "Why do you quarrel with me? Why do you test the Lord?" But the people were so thirsty they were ready to stone Moses. "Why did you bring us up out of Egypt to make us and our children and livestock die of thirst?" Moses cried out to God, and God told him to strike a rock at Horeb with his staff. Moses did, and water gushed out of the rock enough for all the people and their animals. They called the place Massah, testing, and Meribah, quarreling, because the Israelites quarreled and tested God. Shortly after, they faced their first military attack. The Amalekites came and attacked the Israelites at Rephidim. Moses told Joshua, a young leader, to choose men and go fight. Moses himself climbed to the top of a hill with his staff. As long as Moses held his hands up, the Israelites were winning, but whenever he lowered his hands, the Amalekites were winning. When Moses' arms got tired, Aaron and another man named Hur brought a stone for him to sit on, and they held his hands up one on each side until sunset. Joshua defeated the Amalekite army. 3 months after leaving Egypt, the Israelites arrived at the desert of Sinai and camped in front of the mountain, the same mountain where God had appeared to Moses in the burning bush. Moses went up the mountain, and God spoke to him, "This is what you are to say to the Israelites. You yourselves have seen what I did to Egypt, and how I carried you on eagle's wings and brought you to myself. Now if you obey me fully and keep my covenant, then out of all nations you will be my treasured possession. Although the whole earth is mine, you will be for me a kingdom of priests and a holy nation." Moses went back down and told the elders everything God had said. The people all responded together, "We will do everything the Lord has said." God told Moses to prepare the people for a special encounter. They were to consecrate themselves, wash their clothes, and be ready in 3 days. God was going to come down on Mount Sinai in the sight of all the people. On the morning of the 3rd day, there was thunder and lightning over the mountain. A thick cloud covered it, and a very loud trumpet blast sounded. Everyone in the camp trembled. Moses led the people out of the camp to meet with God at the foot of the mountain. Mount Sinai was covered with smoke because God descended on it in fire. The smoke billowed up like smoke from a furnace, and the whole mountain trembled violently. The sound of the trumpet grew louder and louder. Moses spoke, and God answered him in thunder. Then God called Moses to the top of the mountain. And there, in one of the most important moments in human history, God spoke the 10 Commandments. God's voice thundered from the mountain, "I am the Lord your God, who brought you out of Egypt, out of the land of slavery. You shall have no other gods before me. You shall not make for yourself an idol. You shall not misuse the name of the Lord your God. Remember the Sabbath day by keeping it holy. Honor your father and your mother. You shall not murder. You shall not commit adultery. You shall not steal. You shall not give false testimony. You shall not covet." When the people saw the thunder and lightning, heard the trumpet, and saw the mountain in smoke, they trembled with fear and stayed at a distance. They said to Moses, "Speak to us yourself, and we will listen. But don't have God speak to us, or we will die." So Moses approached the thick darkness where God was, and God gave him many more laws about worship, about justice, about how to treat servants, what to do about injuries, laws about property, about social responsibility, about festivals and sacrifices. These laws would form the foundation of Israelite society. God also gave Moses detailed instructions for building a special tent called the tabernacle, which would be God's dwelling place among his people. It was to be made with the finest materials: gold, silver, bronze, fine linen, and precious stones. Inside would be the Ark of the Covenant, a gold-covered chest that would hold the stone tablets of the 10 Commandments. Moses stayed on the mountain for 40 days and 40 nights, receiving all these instructions. God even wrote the 10 Commandments on 2 stone tablets with his own finger. Down below, the people grew restless. Moses had been gone for over a month. They began to worry he wasn't coming back. They went to Aaron and demanded, "Come, make us gods who will go before us. As for this fellow Moses who brought us up out of Egypt, we don't know what has happened to him." Aaron built an altar in front of the calf and announced, "Tomorrow there will be a festival to the Lord." The next day, the people sacrificed burnt offerings and presented fellowship offerings. They sat down to eat and drink and got up to indulge in revelry, a pagan celebration. Up on the mountain, God told Moses, "Go down, because your people have become corrupt. They have turned away from what I commanded them and have made themselves an idol. I have seen these people, and they are a stiff-necked people. Now leave me alone so my anger may burn against them and I may destroy them. Then I will make you into a great nation." But Moses pleaded with God. He reminded God of his promises to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. He argued, "Why should the Egyptians say, 'It was with evil intent that he brought them out, to kill them in the mountains'? Turn from your fierce anger, relent, and do not bring disaster on your people." God listened to Moses and relented. Moses came down the mountain carrying the 2 stone tablets inscribed by God. As he approached the camp with Joshua, they heard the sound of singing. When Moses saw the golden calf and the dancing, his anger burned. He threw the tablets down and they shattered at the foot of the mountain. He took the calf, burned it in the fire, ground it to powder, scattered it on the water, and made the Israelites drink it. Moses confronted Aaron, "What did these people do to you, that you led them into such great sin?" Aaron tried to shift the blame. "You know how prone these people are to evil. They said to me, 'Make us gods.' So I told them to give me their gold, and I threw it into the fire, and out came this calf." It was a pathetic excuse, as if the calf had formed itself. Moses stood at the entrance to the camp and said, "Whoever is for the Lord, come to me." All the Levites rallied to him. Moses gave them a terrible command. They were to go through the camp and put to death those who had led the rebellion. About 3,000 people died that day. The next day, Moses returned to the mountain to plead for the people. "Oh, what a great sin these people have committed," he said to God. "But now please forgive their sin, but if not, then blot me out of the book you have written." God replied, "Whoever has sinned against me, I will blot out of my book." He sent a plague on the people because of what they had done with the calf, but he didn't destroy them all. The covenant would continue. Moses went back up the mountain, and God gave him new stone tablets to replace the ones he had broken. God also revealed his character to Moses in a profound way, proclaiming, the Lord, the compassionate and gracious God, slow to anger, abounding in love and faithfulness, maintaining love to thousands, and forgiving wickedness, rebellion and sin. Yet he does not leave the guilty unpunished." Moses bowed to the ground at once and worshipped. When Moses came down from the mountain this time, his face was radiant. It glowed because he had been speaking with God. The people were afraid to come near him, so Moses had to put a veil over his face when he spoke to them. Now the real work began. Moses told the people about God's instructions for the tabernacle. The people's hearts were stirred, and they brought offerings: gold, silver, bronze, fine linen, animal skins, precious stones, spices, and oils. They brought so much that Moses finally had to tell them to stop. Skilled craftsmen began constructing the tabernacle exactly as God had specified. They made the Ark of the Covenant from acacia wood overlaid with pure gold. They crafted the table for the bread of the presence, the lampstand of pure gold, the altar of incense. They wove the curtains of fine linen with blue, purple, and scarlet yarn. They made the priests' garments ornate robes with bells and pomegranates, a breastpiece set with 12 precious stones representing the 12 tribes of Israel, and a gold plate inscribed with Holy to the Lord. It took months of careful work, but finally, everything was completed exactly as God had commanded. Moses inspected all the work and saw they had done it just as the Lord had commanded. So Moses blessed them. On the first day of the first month of the second year after leaving Egypt, Moses set up the tabernacle. He arranged everything in its proper place: the ark in the most holy place, the table and lampstand, the altar of incense, the altar of burnt offering, and the bronze basin for washing. Then something magnificent happened. The cloud, the same pillar of cloud that had led them through the wilderness and stood between them and the Egyptian army, covered the tabernacle, and the glory of the Lord filled it. Moses couldn't even enter because the cloud had settled on it, and the glory of the Lord filled the tabernacle. From that day forward, the cloud guided them. When the cloud lifted from above the tabernacle, the Israelites would set out. Whenever the cloud settled, they would camp. Whether the cloud stayed over the tabernacle for 2 days, a month, or a year, the Israelites would remain in camp. But when it lifted, they would move on. God's presence was literally in their midst, visible to everyone. God continued to speak to Moses from the tabernacle, giving detailed instructions about offerings and sacrifices, about cleanness and uncleanness, about diseases and how to deal with them, about moral conduct and holy living. These weren't arbitrary rules. They set Israel apart from the nations around them. While their neighbors practiced child sacrifice, temple prostitution, and oppressed the poor, God's laws commanded justice, compassion, and holiness. The Israelites were to be different because they served a different God. God instituted a priesthood. Aaron and his sons were consecrated as priests to serve in the tabernacle. In a 7-day ceremony, they were washed, clothed in special garments, and anointed with oil. Moses sacrificed offerings on their behalf. On the 8th day, Aaron offered his first sacrifices as high priest. When he finished, he blessed the people. Then Moses and Aaron went into the tabernacle, and when they came out, they blessed the people again. And the glory of the Lord appeared to all the people. Fire came out from the presence of the Lord and consumed the burnt offering on the altar. When the people saw it, they shouted for joy and fell face down. But the very next moment turned to tragedy. Aaron's sons Nadab and Abihu took their censers, put fire in them, and added incense. But they offered unauthorized fire before the Lord, contrary to his command. Fire came out from the presence of the Lord and consumed them, and they died before the Lord. Moses said to Aaron, "This is what the Lord spoke of when he said, 'Among those who approach me I will be proved holy. In the sight of all the people I will be honored.'" Aaron said nothing. He was silent in his grief. The lesson was harsh but clear. God's holiness was not to be treated casually. As the months passed, the people continued their pattern of complaint and rebellion. At a place called Taberah, they complained about their hardships, and fire from the Lord burned among them. At Kibroth Hattaavah, they craved meat and complained about the manna. "We remember the fish we ate in Egypt at no cost. Also the cucumbers, melons, leeks, onions, and garlic. But now we have lost our appetite. We never see anything but this manna." Moses was overwhelmed by the burden of leading these people. He cried out to God, "Why have you brought this trouble on your servant? What have I done to displease you that you put the burden of all these people on me? Did I conceive all these people? Did I give them birth? Why do you tell me to carry them in my arms, as a nurse carries an infant? If this is how you are going to treat me, please go ahead and kill me." God's response was twofold. First, he had Moses gather 70 elders, and God put some of the spirit that was on Moses onto them, so they could help him bear the burden of the people. Second, he gave the people the meat they craved, but with consequences. God sent quail, so much quail that it piled up 3 feet deep all around the camp. The people gathered it for 2 days. But while the meat was still between their teeth, the Lord struck them with a severe plague. Even Moses' own family turned against him. His sister Miriam and his brother Aaron began to criticize him, because he had married a Cushite woman. But their real issue was jealousy. Has the Lord spoken only through Moses? Hasn't he also spoken through us? God heard this and immediately summoned all three of them to the tabernacle. He came down in a pillar of cloud and called Aaron and Miriam forward. Then God spoke, "When there is a prophet among you, I reveal myself in visions and speak in dreams. But this is not true of my servant Moses. He is faithful in all my house. With him I speak face to face, clearly and not in riddles. He sees the form of the Lord. Why then were you not afraid to speak against my servant Moses?" The cloud lifted, and Miriam was suddenly leprous, her skin white as snow. Aaron begged Moses to forgive them, and Moses cried out to God, "Please God, heal her." God replied, "If her father had spit in her face, would she not have been in disgrace for 7 days? Confine her outside the camp for 7 days. After that she can be brought back." So Miriam was confined outside the camp for 7 days, and the people did not move on until she was brought back. Finally, after more than a year since leaving Egypt, the Israelites arrived at Kadesh Barnea, on the border of the Promised Land. God told Moses to send men to explore Canaan. Moses selected 12 leaders, one from each tribe, including Joshua from the tribe of Ephraim and Caleb from the tribe of Judah. Moses gave them instructions. Go up through the Negev and on into the hill country. See what the land is like, and whether the people who live there are strong or weak, few or many. What kind of land do they live in? Is it good or bad? What kind of towns do they live in? Are they unwalled or fortified? How is the soil? Is it fertile or poor? Are there trees in it or not? Do your best to bring back some of the fruit of the land. The 12 spies spent 40 days exploring Canaan. They saw fortified cities, various peoples, and incredibly fertile land. At the valley of Eshcol, they cut off a branch with a single cluster of grapes so large that 2 of them had to carry it on a pole between them. They also brought back pomegranates and figs. When they returned, all the Israelites gathered to hear their report. The spies confirmed that the land truly did flow with milk and honey. The fruit proved it. But then 10 of the 12 spies said, however, the people who live there are powerful, and the cities are fortified and very large. We even saw descendants of Anak there. The people began to murmur in fear. Then Caleb spoke up, "We should go up and take possession of the land, for we can certainly do it." But the other spies disagreed. "We can't attack those people. They are stronger than we are." They spread a bad report among the Israelites. "The land we explored devours those living in it. All the people we saw there are of great size. We saw the Nephilim there. We seemed like grasshoppers in our own eyes, and we looked the same to them." That night, all the people wept aloud. They grumbled against Moses and Aaron, "If only we had died in Egypt, or in this wilderness. Why is the Lord bringing us to this land only to let us fall by the sword? Our wives and children will be taken as plunder. Wouldn't it be better for us to go back to Egypt?" And they said to each other, "We should choose a leader and go back to Egypt." Moses and Aaron fell face down before the whole assembly. Joshua and Caleb tore their clothes and addressed the entire assembly. "The land we passed through and explored is exceedingly good. If the Lord is pleased with us, he will lead us into that land and give it to us. Only do not rebel against the Lord, and do not be afraid of the people of the land, because we will devour them. Their protection is gone, but the Lord is with us. Do not be afraid of them." But the assembly talked about stoning them. Then the glory of the Lord appeared at the tabernacle. God said to Moses, "How long will these people treat me with contempt? How long will they refuse to believe in me, in spite of all the signs I have performed among them? I will strike them down with a plague and destroy them, but I will make you into a nation greater and stronger than they." Once again, Moses interceded for the people. He pleaded with God based on his reputation among the nations and his own character of forgiveness. God relented from destroying them, but there would still be consequences. God declared, "Not one of you will enter the land I swore with uplifted hand to make your home, except Caleb and Joshua." As for your children that you said would be taken as plunder, I will bring them in to enjoy the land you have rejected. But as for you, your bodies will fall in this wilderness for 40 years, 1 year for each of the 40 days you explored the land. You will suffer for your sins and know what it is like to have me against you. The 10 spies who had spread the bad report died of a plague before the Lord. Only Joshua and Caleb remained alive. When Moses reported God's words to the Israelites, they mourned bitterly. Early the next morning they said, "Now we are ready to go up to the land the Lord promised. We have sinned." But Moses warned them, "Why are you disobeying the Lord's command? This will not succeed. Do not go up, because the Lord is not with you. You will be defeated by your enemies." They didn't listen. Presumptuously they went up toward the hill country, though neither Moses nor the Ark of the Covenant moved from the camp. The Amalekites and Canaanites who lived in that hill country came down and attacked them, beating them down all the way to Hormah. It was a bitter confirmation of God's judgment. The generation that had left Egypt would not enter the promised land. They would wander in the wilderness until all of them had died. 40 years of wandering for 40 days of unbelief. The years in the wilderness were marked by continued rebellion and God's judgment mixed with mercy. At one point, a man named Korah, along with 250 other leaders, challenged Moses and Aaron's authority. "You have gone too far," they said. "The whole community is holy, every one of them, and the Lord is with them. Why then do you set yourselves above the Lord's assembly?" Moses arranged a test. Korah and his followers would offer incense before the Lord, and God would show whom he had chosen. The next day, when they gathered, the earth literally opened up and swallowed Korah, his household, and all his followers. Fire came out from the Lord and consumed the 250 men who were offering incense. But the very next day, the whole community grumbled against Moses and Aaron. "You have killed the Lord's people." A plague began that killed 14,700 people before Aaron ran with his censer among the people, making atonement, and the plague stopped. To settle the question of leadership once and for all, God had each tribe bring a staff with their leader's name on it. These were placed in the tabernacle overnight. The next morning, Aaron's staff had not only sprouted, but had budded, blossomed, and produced almonds. God had clearly chosen Aaron and his descendants for the priesthood. The years dragged on. The people continued traveling through the wilderness, circling around territories, facing hostile nations. At one point, they had to travel around the land of Edom, and the people grew impatient. Once again, they complained, "Why have you brought us up out of Egypt to die in the wilderness? There is no bread, there is no water, and we detest this miserable food." God sent venomous snakes among them, and many Israelites were bitten and died. The people came to Moses and said, "We sinned when we spoke against the Lord and against you. Pray that the Lord will take the snakes away from us." Moses prayed, and God gave him unusual instructions. "Make a snake and put it up on a pole. Anyone who is bitten can look at it and live." So Moses made a bronze snake and put it up on a pole. When anyone was bitten by a snake and looked at the bronze snake, they lived. It was an object lesson. Salvation comes by faith, by simply looking in trust to what God has provided, not by our own efforts. 38 years had passed since the rebellion at Kadesh Barnea. The older generation was dying off, and a new generation was growing up. One that hadn't known Egypt, that had grown up with the manna, the cloud, the tabernacle, the laws of God. Then came another loss. Miriam, Moses' sister, who had watched over him as a baby, who had led the women in celebration at the Red Sea, died and was buried at Kadesh. At Kadesh, once again, there was no water. Once again, the people quarreled with Moses. And this time, Moses made a costly mistake. God told him to speak to a rock, and it would pour out water. But Moses, frustrated and angry with the people, struck the rock twice with his staff instead of speaking to it. Water gushed out, enough for all the people and their animals. But God said to Moses and Aaron, "Because you did not trust in me enough to honor me as holy in the sight of the Israelites, you will not bring this community into the land I give them." It must have been devastating. After everything Moses had done, all the years of leading these difficult people, he would not enter the promised land. The consequences of a moment's anger and disobedience were severe. Then Aaron died. Moses took Aaron and his son Eleazar up Mount Hor. He removed Aaron's priestly garments and put them on Eleazar, and Aaron died there on top of the mountain. The whole Israelite community mourned for Aaron 30 days. Moses was left alone of the original generation, except for Joshua and Caleb. He was now 120 years old. As the Israelites approached the promised land from the east, they had to pass through territories controlled by various kings. They sent messages requesting peaceful passage, promising not to go through fields or vineyards or drink water from wells. But the kings refused and came out to fight. God gave Israel victory over Sihon, king of the Amorites, and Og, king of Bashan. These were significant military successes, and the Israelites took possession of their land on the east side of the Jordan River. The victories alarmed Balak, king of Moab. He sent for a prophet named Balaam, offering him money to come curse Israel. God told Balaam not to go, but Balaam was tempted by the reward. Eventually, God allowed him to go, but only to speak what God commanded. Balak took Balaam to overlook the Israelite camp, expecting him to curse them. But every time Balaam opened his mouth, blessings came out instead of curses. How can I curse those whom God has not cursed? How can I denounce those whom the Lord has not denounced? How beautiful are your tents, Jacob, your dwelling places, Israel. 4 times Balak tried to get Balaam to curse Israel, and 4 times Balaam blessed them instead. Balak sent Balaam away in anger without his reward. But Balaam found another way to harm Israel. He advised the Moabite and Midianite women to seduce the Israelite men and lead them into idolatry. Many Israelites fell into sexual immorality and began worshiping Baal of Peor. God's anger burned against them, and a plague broke out that killed 24,000 people before it was stopped. Moses knew his time was coming to an end. God had him take a census of the new generation, all the men 20 years old or more who were able to serve in the army. Not one of the original generation that left Egypt was still alive, except Moses, Joshua, and Caleb. Moses divided the land east of the Jordan among the tribes of Reuben, Gad, and the half-tribe of Manasseh. He appointed Joshua as his successor, commissioning him before the whole assembly. God told Moses, "You are going to rest with your ancestors. Now write down this song and teach it to the Israelites. This will be a witness for me against them." Moses gathered the people and taught them a long song recounting everything God had done for them and warning them against future unfaithfulness. He blessed each of the 12 tribes individually. Then Moses gave the Israelites his final speeches, what we know as the Book of Deuteronomy. He reviewed their history, the Exodus, the giving of the law, the wanderings, the rebellions. He repeated the 10 commandments and the laws God had given. He warned them about the dangers of idolatry and the importance of teaching their children about God. "Hear, O Israel," Moses declared, "The Lord our God, the Lord is one. Love the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul and with all your strength." He set before them a choice. "This day I call the heavens and the earth as witnesses against you that I have set before you life and death, blessings and curses. Now choose life, so that you and your children may live, and that you may love the Lord your God, listen to his voice, and hold fast to him." Finally, the time came. God said to Moses, "Go up this mountain of the Abarim range, to Mount Nebo in Moab, and view Canaan, the land I am giving the Israelites as their own possession. There on the mountain you will die, as your brother Aaron died on Mount Hor." Moses, at 120 years old, climbed Mount Nebo. The Bible tells us his eyes were not weak and his strength had not left him. He climbed that mountain with the vigor of a young man. From the summit, God showed Moses the entire promised land, Gilead as far as Dan, all of Naphtali, the territory of Ephraim and Manasseh, all of Judah as far as the Mediterranean Sea, the Negev, and the whole region from the valley of Jericho down to Zor. God said to him, This is the land I promised on oath to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. I have let you see it with your eyes, but you will not cross over into it. And there on Mount Nebo, in the land of Moab, Moses the servant of the Lord died. God himself buried Moses in a valley in Moab, but to this day no one knows where his grave is. The Israelites mourned for Moses in the plains of Moab 30 days. Joshua son of Nun was filled with the spirit of wisdom because Moses had laid his hands on him, and the Israelites listened to him and did what the Lord had commanded Moses. The Bible ends Moses' story with these words, "Since then, no prophet has risen in Israel like Moses, whom the Lord knew face to face, who did all those signs and wonders the Lord sent him to do in Egypt to Pharaoh and to all his officials and to his whole land. For no one has ever shown the mighty power or performed the awesome deeds that Moses did in the sight of all Israel." The story of Moses is ultimately a story about God. God who hears the cries of the oppressed, God who remembers his promises, God who is both just and merciful, God who is holy yet desires to dwell with his people. Moses was the instrument, but God was the author of Israel's redemption. Moses died outside the promised land, but his work was complete. He had brought the Israelites from slavery to the edge of freedom, from a disorganized rabble to an organized nation under God's law, from Egypt to the doorstep of the land God had promised their ancestors. Joshua would lead them across the Jordan. They would conquer the land. Kings would rise and fall. Prophets would come and go. But the foundation Moses laid, the law, the covenant, the knowledge of the one true God, would endure for millennia and shape not just Israel, but human civilization itself. And centuries later, when Jesus stood on a mountain and his face shone like the sun, who appeared with him? Moses and Elijah the lawgiver and the prophet testifying that Jesus was the fulfillment of everything they had pointed toward. The baby in the basket became the deliverer of a nation. The stammering shepherd became the voice of God. Truly, God chooses whoever he wants, not by qualification or position.